My name is Alexander Hale, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed the greatest dangers in life were things like tax audits and rush hour traffic. I was a city person, born and bred. The wilderness was something you saw on a documentary, narrated by a soothing British voice, not something you experienced. My grandfather, Thomas Hale, was the opposite. He was a man carved from the very mountains he called home, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by decades of sun and wind, his hands as tough and calloused as old leather. He lived his entire life in a small, hand-built cabin nestled deep within the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. It was a place where the morning mist clung to the valleys like a shroud, and the silence was so profound it had a weight of its own. As a child, I'd spent a few summers there. I remember the smell of pine and damp earth, the taste of fresh spring water, and the comforting scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. He taught me how to track a deer, how to identify edible plants, and how to read the stars. To me, he was a giant, a man in perfect harmony with nature. But there was always a part of him, a shadow in his eyes when he looked towards the deepest parts of the woods, that I could never quite understand. He had his own ways, his own superstitions, which my grandmother would dismiss with a wave of her hand as mountain nonsense. When my grandmother passed, he retreated even further into his solitude. Our phone calls became less frequent, his voice more distant. Then, 3 weeks ago, I got the call. A heart attack, swift and sudden. He was 82. The funeral was a small affair. A few old-timers from the nearest town, a distant cousin, and me. After, his lawyer, a portly man named Mr. Gable, handed me a set of keys and a large, dusty wooden box secured with a simple brass latch. "He left it all to you, Alex," Mr. Gable said, his voice gentle. "The cabin, the land, everything. He was very specific about it. He also said you were to open this box only when you were at the cabin, and only when you were alone." My heart ached. The cabin was my last tangible connection to him. I decided then and there I would drive up that weekend to sort through his things, to breathe in that mountain air one last time and say a proper goodbye in the place he loved most. I packed a bag, threw it in my car, and began the long drive from the concrete sprawl of the city to the winding, tree-lined roads of the Smokies. The journey was a slow transition from one world to another. Skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills, and soon, the hills swelled into the majestic, blue, hazed mountains that gave the region its name. The final leg of the journey was a gravel road, barely wide enough for one car, that snaked its way up the mountainside. My sedan complained, but it managed. The cabin stood exactly as I remembered it, a sturdy structure of dark logs with a wide porch and a stone chimney. It looked small and lonely against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the forest. I unlocked the heavy oak door, and the familiar scent of old wood smoke, and something else, something uniquely him, washed over me. It was like stepping into a memory. I spent the afternoon exploring the cabin, my fingers tracing the dusty surfaces. Everything was neat, orderly, just as he would have kept it. His favorite armchair by the hearth, a worn copy of Moby Dick. On the side table, his collection of whittled birds on the mantelpiece. It was all so painfully familiar. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, I remembered the box. I brought it to the main table, the wood cool and smooth beneath my fingers. With a click, the brass latch opened. Inside there was no money, no old photographs, no sentimental keepsake. There was only a single object, a thick, leather-bound journal. The leather was worn and cracked with age. His name, Thomas Hale, was embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering. I opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, spidery handwriting. But this wasn't a diary of his daily life. The first page had a title, written in thick, deliberate strokes: rules for surviving at the cabin. I blinked, confused. Surviving. I read on. "Alex, if you are reading this, then I am gone. This cabin, this land, it is yours now. But it is not as peaceful as it seems. These mountains are old, older than any map, and things live here. Things that were here long before us, and will be here long after. The rules in this book are not suggestions. They are not the ramblings of a crazy old man. They are your only defense. Follow them to the letter, and you might see the sunrise. Ignore them, and your soul will become just another whisper on the wind. I love you, son. Be safe." A chill, completely unrelated to the evening air, crept down my spine. It was so unlike him. My grandfather was a practical man, not one for flights of fancy. I turned the page. Rule A1, and do not, under any circumstances, look out the windows after the sun has fully set. You might hear noises, tapping, scratching, voices. Ignore them. What you see out there in the dark is not meant for your eyes, and if it sees you looking back, it will know you are here. And it will want to come in. I let out a short, nervous laugh. It had to be a joke, a final, morbid prank from a man who spent too much time alone. I glanced at the window. The last sliver of orange sun was vanishing, and the forest was a wall of impenetrable black. I felt a sudden, absurd urge to pull the curtains shut. I shook my head, dismissing the feeling. I continued reading. Rule P2, the fire in the hearth must be kept burning from dusk until dawn. It cannot go out. Not even for a minute. The light keeps some of them at bay. Use only the wood from the shed. The wood you find on the forest floor. It's their wood. You don't want to burn their wood. My eyes flickered to the hearth. It was cold and black. A pile of logs and kindling sat in a brass bucket beside it, presumably from the shed. A sense of unease was starting to curdle in my stomach. This was elaborate. I got up, knelt before the fireplace, and began building a fire. It felt silly, like I was humoring a ghost, but the growing darkness and the profound silence of the cabin were beginning to get to me. Soon, a cheerful, crackling fire pushed back the gloom, its warmth a welcome comfort. I returned to the journal. Rule P3, if you hear a woman singing a lullaby outside, go to the bedroom immediately. Lock the door. Do not make a sound. Do not listen to the words of the song. She sounds sweet, but she is not singing for you. She is singing for what she has lost, and she is always looking for a replacement. Okay, this was getting specific and creepy. A singing woman. I tried to rationalize it. A neighbor. No one lived for miles. A hiker. Lost in the dark. The thought was more unsettling than the rule itself. Rule Y4, seen at precisely 3:33 a.m., you will hear a knock on the front door. It will be 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. It is not a person. Do not open the door. Do not ask who is there. Do not even approach the door. Brace a chair against it if you must. He only knocks for a few minutes. He will go away if he believes the house is empty. My blood ran cold. 3:33 a.m. The specificity was terrifying. I looked at the heavy oak door, now a dark, imposing rectangle in the firelight. The simple iron bolt that secured it suddenly seemed flimsy, inadequate. I slammed the journal shut. This was insane. My grandfather, a man I respected and admired, had apparently spent his final years descending into a paranoid delusion. Grief, I told myself. Loneliness, it had warped his mind. The rules were a product of that. A sad, tragic fantasy. I tried to shake it off. I made myself some coffee, the perking sound a small, reassuringly normal noise in the oppressive quiet. I sat in his armchair, the warmth of the fire on my face, and tried to read his copy of Moby Dick. But the words blurred. My mind kept drifting back to the journal. Do not look out the windows. Keep the fire lit. Tap. It was a small sound, from the window to my left. A tiny, sharp rap, like a fingernail against the glass. My head snapped up, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I froze, every muscle tensed. It was probably just a branch, I told myself, swaying in the wind. A pine cone falling. There was a rational explanation. There had to be. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was more insistent, sharper, deliberate. It was not a branch. My gaze was locked on the window, a black, reflective square in the cabin wall. I could see my own terrified face mirrored in it, illuminated by the fire. The rule screamed in my mind. Don't look. Don't let it see you. My breath hitched. I wanted to look. The curiosity was a physical itch, a desperate need to see what was making the sound, to confront the unknown. My body was tense, ready to spring up and tear the curtains aside. But my grandfather's voice, his warning, was a cold anchor in my gut. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on the fire, the crackling of the logs, the hiss of the sap. I recited street names from my city, multiplication tables, anything to distract myself from the sound. Scrape, a new sound, a long, drawn-out scratching against the glass, like claws, or long, dirty fingernails. It moved from one side of the pane to the other, a slow, exploratory sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. My heart felt like it was going to burst. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I grabbed the journal from the table, my hands trembling. I needed to read more. I needed to know what else I was supposed to do. I flipped past the rules I'd already read, my eyes scanning the page. Rule 25. The cabin has a root cellar. The door is in the kitchen floor. You must check that it is bolted from the outside every night before you go to bed. Some things learn to use doors. My blood turned to ice. The root cellar. I remembered it from my childhood. A dark, musty hole in the ground where my grandmother kept preserves. I never liked it. It always felt wrong. The scratching at the window stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was heavy, expectant. Was it gone? Or was it just waiting? I forced myself to my feet, my legs feeling like lead. I had to check the cellar door. I couldn't ignore this. Not now. The fire was my only companion, its light casting my long, dancing shadow ahead of me as I walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was small and cold, away from the hearth's warmth. In the center of the floor was a square trapdoor with a heavy iron ring, and next to it, set into the floorboards, was a thick, iron bolt. It was unlatched. The bolt was slid back, resting in the open position. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been in the kitchen since I arrived, other than to make coffee. My grandfather was a meticulous man. He would never have left it unlocked. My breathing was ragged, shallow gasps in the cold air. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical reason. Vibration from my car on the gravel road. An earthquake. No, it was impossible. Something had opened it. Or, worse, something had come out and failed to lock it on its way. With a shaking hand, I reached down and slammed the heavy bolt home. The thunk of the iron was a small, definitive sound in the terrifying silence. I stood up, my back pressed against the kitchen counter, my eyes darting around the shadows. The cabin no longer felt like a place of comforting memories. It felt like a trap. The walls seemed to be closing in, the darkness outside a living, breathing entity. The rules weren't a prank. They weren't a delusion. They were real. And the night had only just begun. I looked at the clock on the wall. 9:17 p.m., hours to go until sunrise. Hours of darkness, filled with things that tapped on windows, sang deadly lullabies, and knocked on doors. I was alone, miles from anyone, with only a book of terrifying rules standing between me and the things that lived in the shadows of the Smoky Mountains. The silence after I bolted the cellar door was louder than any sound I had ever heard. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, pregnant with horrifying possibilities. I backed away from the kitchen slowly, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor, as if it might burst open at any moment. The walk back to the armchair by the hearth felt like crossing a minefield. Every dancing shadow, every creak of the old cabin's timbers, made my heart leap. I sank into the chair, snatching up the journal. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was a lifeline, the only weapon I had against the unseen darkness that was closing in around my grandfather's cabin. The fire crackled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the cold dread in my chest. I tossed another log on, watching the flames greedily lick the wood. Rule Fate 2 echoed in my mind. The fire must be kept burning. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages past the rules I'd already encountered. My rational mind was screaming in denial, but a primal survival instinct was shrieking that every word in this book was a terrifying truth. I had to know more. I had to be ready for what was coming next. Rule Fate 6e. If you see a reflection in a window that is not your own, even for a moment, close your eyes and count slowly to 50. Do not acknowledge it. It feeds on attention. I swallowed hard, the memory of my own reflection in the glass, when the tapping started flashing in my mind. What if I had seen something else? What if another face had been staring back at me from the darkness? The thought made me nauseous. I vowed not to look at the windows again, no matter what. Rule Paint 7a. The carved wooden birds on the mantel are your allies. If one of them falls, it means something has breached the outer defenses of the cabin. You are no longer safe in the main room. My eyes shot up to the small, whittled birds lined up on the mantelpiece. They had seemed so simple, so insignificant, just the hobby of an old man. Now, they held a new, sinister importance. They were sentinels, an early warning system. I counted them, 7 in total, each frozen in a different pose of flight. Rule Pate 80, there is an iron chest in the bedroom. The key is taped beneath the leftmost hearthstone. Inside are supplies you may need. Salt, iron nails. Do not use them unless a rule tells you to. They are finite. A flicker of hope. Supplies, weapons. It was something tangible in this intangible nightmare. I didn't hesitate. I knelt by the fireplace, feeling for a loose edge on the far, left stone. And there it was. The stone shifted slightly. Taped to the underside was a small, cold, antique iron key. I scrambled to the bedroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The room was small and Spartan: a bed, a wardrobe, and at the foot of the bed, the black iron chest. It looked ancient and strong, bound with thick straps, though the lock itself looked surprisingly delicate. I inserted the key and turned. The click of the mechanism was deafening in the silence. I heaved the heavy lid open. A musty smell of metal and earth, mixed with dried herbs, wafted out. Inside, there were no guns or knives as I had half hoped. There was something far stranger. Several small, tightly bound canvas bags filled with coarse sea salt. A wooden box full of slightly rusted iron nails. And, most bizarrely, several small glass vials of clear liquid, each containing a sprig of rosemary. These weren't survival supplies. These were the tools of an exorcist, of someone fighting an ancient evil. I closed the chest, any sense of security I'd gained vanishing. It was replaced by the heavy understanding that my grandfather's fight hadn't been against wildlife or human intruders. It had been a spiritual one, a long-running war against things that existed outside of my comprehension. I returned to the fire, the journal open on my lap. Time crawled by at a torturous pace. Every minute was a small victory. I kept the fire fed, and I kept glancing at the 7 wooden birds. They remained still. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the frantic drumming of my own heart. Then, I heard it. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it. A melody, drifting on the night air. A woman's voice, humming a lullaby. It was a simple, sweet tune, yet it was filled with a beautiful sadness. Rule Fay 3 slammed into my consciousness. If you hear a woman singing a lullaby outside, go to the bedroom immediately. Lock the door. Do not make a sound. A moment of hesitation. The voice was so pathetic. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded like a mother singing to her sleeping child. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe she needed help. No, my grandfather's voice roared in my head. She is not singing for you. I launched myself from the chair, bolting for the bedroom and slamming the door shut. I threw the deadbolt and twisted the lock. The singing grew louder, as if she were walking closer to the cabin. The lyrics were in a language I didn't recognize, an ancient tongue that sounded like rustling leaves and running water. But the emotion was universal. It was loss. A painful, yearning loss. The singing stopped directly outside my bedroom window. I stood frozen in the center of the room, holding my breath. I felt an overwhelming urge to look, to comfort this poor woman, to tell her everything would be okay. But my grandfather's rule echoed. She is looking for a replacement. I backed away from the window, pressing my hands over my ears, but I could still hear it. It seeped through the wood, through my bones, into my soul. I sank to the floor, curling into a ball, praying for it to stop. After an eternity, the singing began to fade. It grew softer and softer, until it was nothing more than the sound of the wind in the trees. I stayed on the floor for several long minutes, shaking. The returning silence was almost as terrifying as the song had been. Finally, I summoned the courage to stand and unlock the door. I stepped out into the main room. The first thing I noticed was the fire. It had burned down to glowing embers. Panic flared in me, and I frantically added more kindling, blowing on it until the flames caught again. I had almost broken Rule 82. I glanced at the old wall clock. 1:47 a.m., hours to go until dawn, and the most dreaded rule was still ahead of me. Rule Fay 4. I spent the next hour in a state of hyper-vigilance. I didn't dare sit down. I paced the small room, clutching the iron fire poker like a club. I kept the fire roaring and my eyes on the 7 birds. They remained steadfast. The clock ticked mercilessly toward 3:33 a.m. The tension in the cabin became a physical thing. I reread Rule 54 over and over. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It is not a person. Do not open the door. I followed its advice. I dragged my grandfather's heavy armchair across the floor and wedged it against the front door, bracing it under the knob. It was a flimsy barricade, but it was something. 3:30 a.m. My heart was a war drum. 3:31 a.m. I wiped slick sweat from my forehead. 3:32 a.m. The cabin fell unnervingly silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Everything was waiting. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the front door. The second hand on the clock swept onward, each tick a hammer blow of fate. It reached the 12. 3:33 a.m. The silence held. A second passed. Then another. Nothing. Maybe it wouldn't come tonight. Maybe I was lucky. KMOC. The sound ripped through the silence. It was deep and resonant, as if someone had struck the thick oak with a massive fist. It vibrated through the floorboards and up into my bones. KMOC. The second one came a few seconds later. Harder. More powerful. The chair I had wedged against the door rattled ominously. I held my breath, staring at the door in abject terror. KNOCK. The third. The final. This one was filled with a malevolent, ancient patience. It was not the knock of a human. It was the knock of something that wanted in, and it knew I was here. The third knock echoed into nothingness, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I stood paralyzed in the center of the room, my knuckles white on the fire poker, my entire being focused on the thick oak door. The heavy armchair wedged beneath the knob was my only comfort, a fragile dam against a malevolent ocean. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just waited for the wood to splinter, for the lock to burst. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The knocker did not try again. Instead, a new sound began, a low, guttural scraping at the very bottom of the door. It was the sound of something heavy and dense being dragged across the wooden porch, right up to the threshold. It was followed by a soft, wet sniffing sound, exploring the crack between the door and the floor. It was searching for a way in. It knew I was there. It was patient. I remained frozen, a statue of terror. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. The rules were clear. Do not open the door. Do not ask who is there. Do not even approach the door. My only defense was to pretend the house was empty, a hollow shell devoid of the life it so desperately craved. The sniffing continued for what felt like hours, a slow, methodical examination of my flimsy fortress. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I felt a change in the atmosphere, a lessening of the intense pressure. The presence, whatever it was, had moved on. For now. The release of tension was so abrupt that my knees buckled. I stumbled back to the armchair, my body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. I had survived. I had followed the rule, and I had survived. But the relief was fleeting, immediately replaced by the horrifying knowledge that this was just one trial among many, and the night was far from over. My eyes fell upon the journal, still open on the floor, where I dropped it. I needed more information. I had to know what other horrors these mountains held. With a trembling hand, I picked it up and forced myself to read on, the crackling fire my only witness. Rule 590, the things outside can mimic sounds they have heard. A crying baby, a wounded animal, a familiar voice. Your mind will want to believe them. Your heart will want to help. Do not. Compassion is a weapon they will use to get inside your soul. This rule sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. I thought of the woman's lullaby. It had sounded so full of sorrow, so real. What if the knocker had tried a different tactic? What if it had called to me in my mother's voice, or my grandfather's? Would I have been strong enough to resist? I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty terrified me. Rule Fay 10A. Do not eat any food you find in the cabin that was not sealed in a can or a jar when you arrived. Some things can spoil more than just the flesh. They can spoil the mind. Stick to the canned beans. They're bland, but they're safe. I glanced at the kitchen, at the open bag of bread and the small wheel of cheese I had bought on my way up. I had been snacking on them earlier. A paranoid thought wormed its way into my brain. Had something already tainted them? Was the fear I was feeling entirely my own? I pushed the thought away. The rule said food found in the cabin. My food was from the outside world. It had to be safe. Still, I resolved to only eat the canned goods from now on. Rule FLNT. If you smell the scent of damp soil and sweet, rotting flowers, it means one of them is close to the walls. It is trying to find a way through the wood itself. Hold your breath for as long as you can. The scent can lull you into a stupor, a waking dream from which you will not want to wake. The specificity of these rules was what made them so horrifying. They weren't vague warnings, they were detailed instructions, born from decades of terrifying experience. My grandfather had lived this nightmare day in and day out. The thought filled me with a profound sadness and a newfound respect for the strength he must have possessed. I checked the clock. 4012 a.m. The sky outside was still a sheet of impenetrable black. Dawn was a distant, desperate hope. I added more logs to the fire, the simple, physical act a small anchor in the swirling chaos of my fear. I sat, listening, my senses stretched to their breaking point. Thud. The sound was soft, but it cut through the quiet like a gunshot. It came from the mantelpiece. My head snapped up. One of the carved wooden birds, a small, delicate sparrow, had fallen from its perch. It lay on its side on the cold hearthstone, its tiny wooden wings askew. Rule Fight 7 screamed in my mind. If one of them falls, it means something has breached the outer defenses of the cabin. You are no longer safe in the main room. A primal, gut-wrenching panic seized me. The outer defenses. What did that even mean? The invisible line of protection my grandfather had somehow built around this place had been broken. Something was in. Not inside the cabin, not yet, but it was past the first gate. My eyes darted back to the journal, my fingers fumbling with the pages. There had to be another rule, something to do, a countermeasure. I found it near the back, the handwriting more frantic, more rushed than the others. Rule Fay 12: if a bird falls, the wards are compromised. You must reinforce the thresholds immediately. Use the salt from the iron chest. Pour a thick, unbroken line across every windowsill, and at the base of every door leading outside. Leave no gaps. They are repelled by the salt, but only if the line is perfect. Then, take one of the iron nails and hammer it into the floor in front of the hearth. It will ground the cabin's energy and strengthen the remaining wards. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted to the bedroom, threw open the iron chest, and grabbed one of the canvas bags of salt. It was surprisingly heavy. I also grabbed a single, rust-colored iron nail and the small hammer I'd seen in the chest. As I ran back into the main room, I heard it. A soft, wet, dragging sound from the front porch. The same sound I'd heard after the knocking, but closer now, more confident. Alex. The voice was my grandmother's. It was her voice exactly. The slight tremor, the gentle, loving tone she always used with me. It came from just outside the front door. Alex, honey, what are you doing in there? Let your old grandma in. It's so cold out here. Rule Fay 9. It can mimic sounds. My heart shattered. It was a cruel, twisted violation of my most cherished memories. Tears streamed down my face, but my hands didn't stop. I knelt at the front door, the bag of salt shaking, and began to pour. A thick, white line of crystals formed on the floorboards. Don't be rude, Alexander. The voice chided, the warmth gone, replaced by a sharp, impatient edge. Your grandfather taught you better manners than that. Open this door. I ignored it, moving to the back door. My hands working frantically to pour another perfect line. The dragging sound moved with me, circling the cabin. Next, the windows. As I approached the first one, the one where the tapping had started, my grandmother's voice was right there, whispering against the glass. I see you, Alex. Hiding in the dark. You can't hide from me. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing only on the task, on the feel of the salt pouring through my fingers. I finished the first window and moved to the next. The voice began to change, to warp. The loving tone stretched and distorted, becoming something monstrous and guttural, a grotesque parody of the woman I loved. I'll hufef, and I'll puff, and I'll owe you your soul. It shrieked, the sound vibrating through the very logs of the cabin. I finished the last windowsill just as a new sensation hit me, a smell, the cloying sweetness of rotting flowers in the damp, earthy scent of a freshly dug grave. Rule 11. It was right outside the wall. I held my breath, my lungs burning, my vision starting to swim with black spots. I stumbled back to the hearth, the iron nail and hammer clutched in my hand. I dropped to my knees before the fire, placed the tip of the nail against the floorboards, and brought the hammer down. Hack! The sound was clean and final. As the iron nail bit into the wood, a low hum vibrated through the cabin, and the oppressive smell and the horrifying voice from outside vanished instantly. Cut off. Silence returned. I gasped for air, collapsing onto the floor, my body slick with sweat. I looked around the room. The salt lines gleamed in the firelight, thin white lines of hope. The fallen bird still lay on the hearth. The single iron nail stood sentinel in the floor. The clock read 5:38 a.m. I had done it. I had survived. I spent the final hour before sunrise huddled in the armchair, watching those salt lines as if my life depended on it, which it did. As the first, faint, gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the oppressive atmosphere inside the cabin finally began to lift. The shadows seemed less menacing, the silence less threatening. When the sun finally crested the mountain, flooding the room with glorious, warm light, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it was physically painful. I had made it through the night. I stood up on shaky legs, and for the first time since sunset, I walked to a window and looked out. The forest was beautiful, serene. The morning mist rising from the trees like gentle ghosts. It looked exactly like the peaceful mountain landscape I remembered from my childhood. But I knew better now. I knew what walked in the shadows, what sang in the dark, what knocked on the doors of lonely cabins. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone despite the morning sun, that I would have to do it all over again tonight. Daylight did not bring peace, only a temporary reprieve. The terror of the night clung to me like the mountain mist, a cold, damp film on my soul. I was exhausted, every muscle aching from tension, but sleep was an impossible luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the distorted, hateful face of my grandmother's mimic, heard the deep, resonant knock that wasn't human. I had survived, yes, but the victory felt hollow. The sun was a spotlight on a stage, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that the play would resume the moment the lights went down. I couldn't just wait for the next onslaught. I couldn't spend another night as a cornered animal. My grandfather didn't just survive here, he lived here. He must have had a system, a routine, a way of fighting back that went beyond just huddling by the fire. The journal was my key, but I needed to understand the battlefield. Fueled by a desperate mix of fear and adrenaline, I forced myself to eat 2 cans of cold beans, the metallic taste a grim reminder of Rule Fate 10. Then, I began my investigation. I started with the outside of the cabin, stepping out into the morning sun, with the iron fire poker clutched in my hand. The world looked deceptively normal. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and the air was crisp and clean. But the evidence of the night's horrors was there if you knew where to look. At the base of the front door, deep googe, like scratches marred the thick oak, far too wide and jagged to be from any normal animal. It looked as though something had tried to claw its way through solid wood. I circled the cabin, my eyes scanning the ground. Beneath the window where the singing woman had stood, the grass was yellowed and dead in a perfect circle, as if poisoned from the roots up. A faint, sickly, sweet smell of rot still lingered in the air, even in the bright sunlight. I felt a profound sense of violation. These things weren't just attacking the cabin, they were poisoning the land itself. My next stop was the woodshed. According to Rule Fate 2, this was the only safe source of firewood. The shed was a small, windowless structure a short distance from the cabin. Inside, stacks of perfectly cut and dried logs reached the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something else. Carved into the inside of the door was a complex, circular symbol, similar to a compass rose but with intricate, spidery runes instead of directions. And on the end of every single log, a smaller, simpler version of the same symbol had been branded into the wood. My grandfather hadn't just been chopping wood, he'd been consecrating it, turning each log into a small ward against the dark. The fire wasn't just light and heat, it was a weaponized barrier of holy flame. The discovery galvanized me. This was a war, and my grandfather had been a soldier. I had to think like one. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. I spent the next several hours ransacking the place, not for valuables, but for knowledge. I looked for hidden compartments, loose floorboards, anything that might hold more of his secrets. My search led me to his bedroom, to the old, musty wardrobe. Behind a false back panel, I found another box. This one was smaller, made of dark wood, and filled not with supplies, but with more of my grandfather's writings. There were newspaper clippings of missing hikers dating back 50 years, hand-drawn maps of the area with strange symbols marking certain locations, and several more, smaller journals. These journals were different from the Book of Rules. They were his bestiary, his field notes on the enemy. I sat on the floor, my back against the bed, and read for hours, my blood running colder with every page. He wrote about the singing woman, or the lure, a spirit of profound loss that seeks to steal the living to replace the child it lost to the river centuries ago. He described the knocker, an ancient, territorial entity that guards the mountain's deepest parts, a thing of stone and shadow that despises warmth and life. He called it Old Stony, and he wrote about others, things I hadn't yet encountered. The Watchers, disembodied red lights that were the eyes of something vast and hungry that slumbered beneath the mountains. The Path, Twister, a trickster entity that could rearrange the forest itself to lead travelers into traps. As I read, a new set of rules began to form in my mind, gleaned from his desperate, terrified scrawlings. Rule Fay 3rd Trinity, the forest is not your friend after dark. Do not leave the clearing around the cabin. The paths you know from the day will not be the same. They will lead you to the water, or to the rocks, but never back home. Rule Fay 4 2A, if you see two small red lights hovering in the woods, get inside immediately and do not look at them. They are the watchers. If they see your face, they will report it to their master, and the mountain itself will turn against you. Rule Fun 15D. The mirror in the bathroom is a weak spot, a potential door. My grandfather had covered it with a thick, black cloth, secured with duct tape. The journal entry was stark: keep it covered. At night it reflects what they want to see, not what is there. If the cloth falls, break the mirror. A shattered door is better than an open one. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red that no longer looked beautiful, only ominous. The second night was coming, but this time I would be more prepared. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the cabin's guardian. I checked the salt lines from the previous night, reinforcing any thin spots. I picked up the fallen sparrow from the hearth and placed it carefully in the iron chest, whispering a thank you. I found the heavy black cloth over the bathroom mirror and pressed down on the tape, ensuring it was secure. I ate more cold beans. I kept the fire poker close. As dusk settled, a new kind of silence fell. It wasn't the expectant silence of the first night. It was a hunting silence. They knew I had survived. They knew I had reinforced the wards. Tonight would be different. They would test me in new ways. The first sign came just after full dark. It wasn't a sound. It was a light. Through a small gap in the curtains of a side window, I saw them. Two small, ruby, red pinpricks of light hovering in the woods about 100 yards away. Rule Fay 14. The watchers. They weren't moving, just floating there, observing. I felt a cold, analytical intelligence behind them, a stark contrast to the raw emotion of the lure or the brute force of the knocker. I quickly closed the gap in the curtains, my heart hammering. They had seen the cabin's light. They knew someone was home. An hour passed. The red lights remained, unmoving. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, but it wasn't coming from a window or a door. It was coming from the roof. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like rain, but the sky had been clear. The sound moved slowly, methodically, from one end of the roof to the other, then back again. It was the sound of something walking up there. Something light on its feet. I grabbed the journal, frantically searching for a rule, a mention of anything on the roof. I found nothing. This was new. This was an improvisation. My grandfather's rules were a guide, but the enemy was capable of adapting. The tapping stopped directly above me. A scraping sound followed, the sound of sharp claws digging into the wooden shingles. Then, a new sound, one that chilled me to my very marrow. A soft, childish giggle echoed down the chimney, followed by a whisper that seemed to slither down with the smoke. "Can I come in? I lost my ball."
My name is Alex Easton. For the better part of a decade, I worked as a senior archivist for a major metropolitan museum. A career that sounds far more tranquil than it is. The reality was a life lived under the constant, low, great assault of the city, the percussive rattle of subway trains vibrating through the floor, the incessant chorus of sirens that were so common they became meaningless background noise, the sheer psychic weight of millions of lived in such close, clamoring proximity. I craved silence. Not just the absence of noise, but a deep, foundational quiet that I felt I had lost somewhere in my 20s. And so, after a modest inheritance gave me the freedom to do so, I sought it out. My search led me to Havenwood, tucked away in a fold of rolling hills and dense, old-growth forests. The town was the very picture of rustic serenity. The online listings showed a small, self-contained community with a quaint town square, a single general store, a post office, and a beautiful stone-built library. that made my professional heart ache with longing. It was perfect. I purchased a small, clapboard house on the edge of town, one that backed onto the woods, and imagined a life of quiet research, writing, and listening to the sound of the wind in the pines. For the first 2 weeks, Havenwood was everything I had dreamed of. The quiet was so profound, it was almost a physical presence. It settled over the town like a soft blanket, muffling the world. The people were pleasant in a reserved, small-town way. A nod from Mrs. Gable at the general store. A quiet afternoon from the sheriff, a man whose name I learned was Miller. A brief chat about the weather with my neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, as he meticulously tended his rose bushes. They were polite, but not effusive. Their conversations were brief, their smiles genuine but fleeting. There was a placid, uniform calm to them all, an unruffled quality that I initially mistook for contentment. I began to notice small oddities, the kind of details an archivist is trained to spot. Strange, woven figures, like small, desiccated men made of corn husks and twine, hung from the eaves of many houses, including my own. They were weathered and ancient-looking. When I asked Mr. Abernathy about the one on my porch, he simply smiled his placid smile. Just a bit of town tradition, he'd said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Brings good fortune. I also noted the curious absence of squirrels and most common birds in the town proper. The woods were alive with them, but it was as if an invisible line had been drawn at the town's edge that they would not cross. These were minor dissonances, easily dismissed quirks of a secluded community. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in my 3rd week, I heard the siren. It was not the familiar, rising and falling wail of a city fire engine or ambulance. This was something else entirely. It began as a low, resonant hum. A vibration I felt in the floorboards and in my teeth before I properly heard it. The hum grew steadily, climbing the scale into a single, piercing, mechanical shriek that was impossibly loud. It was a clean, industrial sound, yet it had a strange, almost organic overtone. A dissonant chord that seemed to scrape at the inside of my skull. It was a sound of pure, undiluted alarm. My first instinct, born of city life, was to look out the window for smoke or signs of panic. I saw neither. Instead, I witnessed something far more unsettling. With a synchronicity that was utterly unnatural, Havenwood simply stopped. Mrs. Gable, who had been sweeping her storefront, calmly put her broom aside, went inside, and locked the door. Mr. Abernathy, who had been on his knees in his garden, stood up, dusted off his trousers, and walked into his house without a backward glance. A delivery truck that had been rumbling down Main Street pulled silently to the curb, its engine cutting out. Within 30 seconds of the siren's first note, the streets were empty. The town was still. The siren blared for exactly 5 minutes. When it cut off, the silence it left behind was absolute, a vacuum that was heavier and more profound than the usual quiet. It was a weighted, listening silence. I stood at my window for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt exposed, a solitary figure in a ghost town. After another 10 minutes, just as unnervingly synchronized as their disappearance, the people returned. doors unlocked. The delivery truck started its engine. Mrs. Gable resumed her sweeping. It was as if nothing had happened. The next day, I tried to ask about it. My curiosity was simple, unalarming. I was at the general store, buying milk. "That was quite a siren yesterday," I said to Mrs. Gable, forcing a casual laugh. "Tornado drill?" She smiled, the same placid, distant smile as everyone else. "Oh, that old thing," she said, her hands busy arranging a display of canned peaches. "Don't you pay it any mind." "But what is it for?" I pressed gently. "Is it from the old fire station?" "It's just something the town does, dear," she replied, her tone one of finality, though it remained perfectly pleasant. "A tradition, you could say. Like the figures. I tried the sheriff later that week, catching him as he was getting into his cruiser. Sheriff Miller. I began. I was just wondering about the siren protocol. In case of a real emergency, am I supposed to do anything specific?" He turned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Annoyance, or perhaps warning. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same practiced calm. "No protocol to worry about, Mr. Easton. You're safe here in Havenwood. That's the whole point of this place." He gave a short nod, got in his car, and drove away, leaving me standing on the curb, with my unanswered question hanging in the air. It was the same everywhere I went. The librarian, a young woman named Clara, simply shook her head with a little smile and changed the subject to a new shipment of books. The postman pretended not to hear me over the sound of his sorting. It was a wall of pleasant, smiling denial. They weren't hostile or secretive in a way that felt aggressive. Their refusal to engage was so gentle, so uniform. It felt like a form of mass gaslighting. They were all reading from the same script, and the core message was that I was the strange one for even asking. After a week of these polite deflections, I started to question my own judgment. Was I being paranoid? Was this some bizarre social test for the new resident? A local joke I wasn't privy to. But the feeling of profound wrongness wouldn't leave me. It lingered. A cold spot in the otherwise warm and welcoming town. The siren sounded again 2 weeks later, exactly the same as before. The rising hum, the 5-minute shriek, the synchronized disappearance of the townsfolk, and the heavy, listening silence that followed. This time, I watched from my upstairs window, my study, which overlooked the woods. As the town fell silent, my eyes were drawn to the forest edge. I saw nothing, of course. Just the deep, dark green of the pines and the shadows gathering beneath them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't empty. The town wasn't hiding from the siren. They were hiding from what the siren called forth. Or perhaps what it kept at bay. That night, unable to sleep, I sat on my porch, the woven husk figure swinging gently in the breeze beside me. It looked like a tiny, screaming man, its twined limbs twisted in silent agony. I had lived in a city where 1,000 sirens a day signaled 1,000 individual tragedies. They were loud, chaotic, and honest. Here, there was only one siren. It was clean, orderly, and punctual. And it was built on a foundation of terrifying, unspoken consensus. It was a signal, I was beginning to realize, not of an emergency, but of an agreement. A terrible, recurring appointment that the entire town was complicit in keeping. And the most frightening part was the placid, unwavering silence they maintained about it. It was a silence that felt older and more powerful than any sound. A silence that held the town in its grip. I knew then that I couldn't let it go. I had come to Havenwood seeking quiet, but the quiet I had found was the most horrifying noise of all. My professional life had taught me one fundamental truth. People lie, but paper remembers. Every community, no matter how small or secretive, leaves a trail. Town charters, meeting minutes, census data, local newspapers. These are the bones of a place's history, and I was an expert at articulating their skeletons. The wall of placid denial I'd encountered was social. The archives, I reasoned, would be silent, impartial, and, most importantly, honest. My investigation began, naturally, at the stone-built library I had so admired. Clara, the librarian, was behind the circulation desk, stamping books with a rhythmic, peaceful thud. Her smile was as serene as ever when I approached. "Mr. Easton," she greeted me, looking for a novel to curl up with. "Actually, Clara, I was hoping to access the town archives, specifically old newspapers from, say, the 1920s and 30s, and any town planning records from that era." The smile didn't falter, but it tightened at the edges. A flicker of something, the same guarded look I'd seen in Sheriff Miller's eyes, passed through her own. "Of course. Our collection is in the basement. I'll have to unlock it for you. Though I should warn you, we had a bit of a flood down there years ago. Some of the older records are in poor condition. A real shame." She led me down a narrow set of wooden stairs into a cool, dry basement that smelled of old paper and dust. It was meticulously organized, far from the water, damaged chaos she had described. Bound volumes of the Havenwood Chronicle were lined up on metal shelves. She unlocked a wire mesh gate for me. "Just lock this up when you're done," she said, her voice still light and airy. "And please, be careful. They're very fragile." I spent the next 4 hours surrounded by the ghosts of Havenwood's past. I started with the newspapers. The 1920s were filled with the mundane trivia of small town life, harvest festivals, church bake sales, local politics. But as I moved into the 1930s, I found the gaps. Not just a missing issue here or there, but entire months gone. October 1934, August 1935, October 1936, a biennial pattern of absence. When I cross-referenced the town meeting minutes, I found the same thing. The records for those corresponding months were neatly sliced out of the ledgers with a razor-sharp blade. It wasn't damage. It was surgical removal. A deliberate, careful erasure. Frustrated, I turned my attention to the town's founding. In a box of miscellaneous documents, I found a copy of the original Havenwood Charter from 1856. It was mostly standard legal boilerplate, but one section, Article the Sire, was bizarre. It spoke of the community's duty to uphold cyclical obligations and ensure communal preservation through periodic appeasement. It mentioned a compact with the land itself, a promise to maintain the harmony in exchange for prosperity and protection from the hunger of the wood. It was archaic, unsettling language, more befitting a cult manifesto than a town charter. My search was interrupted by the next siren. It was a Tuesday. I had lost track of the days. The hum started, vibrating up through the concrete floor of the library basement. Upstairs, I heard the gentle thud of the front door being locked. I was alone in the archive, the single bare bulb overhead casting long, dancing shadows. This time the sound felt different. It wasn't just loud. It was predatory. The dissonant overtone felt like a physical pressure against my ears, a scraping sound that seemed to be searching for a way into my head. I felt a primal urge to hide, to curl up in the darkest corner of the basement and wait it out. Instead, I forced myself up the stairs. The library was empty, bathed in the eerie afternoon light, filtering through the tall windows. I crept to the front door and peered through the glass. The street was utterly still, a perfect tableau of a town holding its breath. But my eyes were drawn to the woods, at the end of the street. The siren was meant to drive people indoors, to make them hide. But what if its true purpose was to clear the stage for something else? As the siren reached its 5-minute crescendo and cut out, the silence that fell was different. It wasn't just heavy, it was hungry. And in that silence, I heard it. A faint, wet, rhythmic tearing sound coming from the direction of the woods. It was accompanied by a smell that drifted on the air, a coppery, metallic scent like a slaughterhouse, mixed with the cloying sweetness of pine sap. My blood ran cold. It was the sound of feeding. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled with the lock on the wire, mesh gate to the archives. My hands shaking too much to work the key. I left it unlocked and hurried out of the library's back entrance, my mind reeling. The polite smiles, the gentle deflections, they were all a mask for this monstrous, recurring event. The next day, the atmosphere in town had changed. The placid calm was still there, but now it felt brittle, like a sheet of ice over a dark, deep lake. The smiles didn't reach anyone's eyes. The nods were curt. I was no longer just the curious newcomer. I was a threat. I felt their eyes on me as I walked to the general store, their gazes lingering a moment too long. The unspoken consensus had shifted. I had looked behind the curtain, and they knew it. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley, Sheriff Miller's cruiser pulled up to my house. He didn't use his lights or siren. He just appeared, a dark shape in the twilight. He got out of the car and walked slowly to my porch, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He didn't smile. "Mr. Easton," he said, his voice low and even. "I heard you were asking about our town's history. Found your time in the archives fruitful." I stood in my doorway, the frame feeling like the only solid thing in the world. "I found some inconsistencies," I said, my own voice tight. Miller nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on mine. "Havenwood is a special place. A quiet place. People come here for that quiet. They respect it. They understand that some things are best left undisturbed. They don't go poking around in basements, asking questions that have no answers." He took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. "You came here seeking quiet, didn't you? I strongly suggest you find it. Stop digging. Because some histories are buried for a reason. And if you dig them up, you might just find yourself buried with them." He held my gaze for a long moment, the threat hanging in the air, as sharp and clear as the siren's shriek. Then he turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove away, leaving me alone in the deepening darkness. The woven husk figure on my porch swung in the breeze, its silent scream a mirror of my own. I now understood. The siren wasn't a drill or a tradition. It was a dinner bell. And the entire town was dedicated to making sure the meal was served on time. My isolation was no longer just social. It was absolute. I was a loose thread in their perfect, horrifying tapestry, and I had a sinking feeling they were about to pull me. Sheriff Miller's threat was a turning point. The town's mask of pleasantries didn't just slip, it was cast aside. The quiet nods ceased. The fleeting smiles vanished. Now, when I walked down Main Street, I was met with flat, hard stares. Conversations would stop as I approached, resuming in hushed tones only after I had passed. "Mr. Abernathy no longer tended his roses. Instead, he seemed to spend his days watching my house from his porch, his stillness more unnerving than any overt action. The quiet I had once craved had become a weapon, a suffocating blanket of communal hostility. I was no longer a resident. I was a specimen under a microscope. My isolation became physical. The day after Miller's visit, my landline went dead. When I tried my cell phone, there was no signal, a problem I'd never had before. I walked to the general store to report it, and Mrs. Gable gave me a thin, pitying look. "Lines must be down," she said, not bothering to check. "Happens out here." My internet flickered and died that afternoon. The next morning, when I tried to start my car to drive to the next town over, the engine wouldn't turn over. It was a systematic, deliberate severing of my connections to the outside world. They were tightening the net, and the dread was a physical weight in my chest, a constant, low hum of terror that mimicked the siren itself. Panic began to set in, a cold, sharp. I was trapped. My house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Driven by a desperate, frantic energy, I began to search it, not for a way out, but for an answer. I was an archivist, and my instincts told me that the history of this place, this house, might hold a clue. I ran my hands along the walls, tapped the floorboards, checked for fallbacks in closets. It was in the small study upstairs, the room that overlooked the woods, that I found it. A single floorboard beneath the desk was slightly loose. Using the tip of a letter opener, I pried it up. Beneath it, nestled in the dusty space between the joists, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with tight, spidery handwriting. A name was inscribed on the inside cover: Elias Thorne, the man who sold me the house, the man who, according to the realtor, had retired to a warmer climate. The journal began much as my own story had, a man seeking refuge from a noisy world. Charmed by Havenwood's serenity, he wrote of the quiet, the polite but distant townsfolk, the strange corn husk figures. Then came his first entry about the siren. His confusion mirrored my own, as did his frustration at the wall of smiling denial. But Elias had been here longer. His paranoia had had more time to fester and grow. He started documenting the siren's schedule, noting its biennial pattern long before I had. He connected it to the gaps in the town's history, the same ones I'd found in the library. October 12th, one entry read: "They are watching me. I see them from the window. They pretend to be gardening, to be fixing their roofs, but they are always watching. They know I have been asking questions. They know I don't belong. The silence is the worst part. It's not empty. It's full of their judgment, their consensus. It presses in on me." Then the journal took a darker turn. Elias wrote about what he called the hum of the earth. He didn't think it was a single creature. He described it as a consciousness in the land itself, a primal hunger that resided in the ancient woods. The siren, he theorized, was a specific harmonic frequency, a key that both called to this entity and placated it, focusing its attention. It was a sound that said, "Here is your due. Be satisfied and leave us in peace." November 3rd, I saw it, or a part of it. After the siren, I hid in the attic and watched the woods. It wasn't a beast of flesh and blood. It was moving earth, roots and soil, and wet leaves, shifting into a form that was horribly, vaguely bipedal. It shambled at the edge of the trees, drawn by the siren's echo. The smell. Oh, God, the smell of rot and fresh blood. It was looking for something. The final section of the journal was where my blood ran truly cold. Elias had finally broken through the town's silence, but not in the way he'd hoped. He'd cornered the librarian, an older woman, not Clara, and demanded answers. And she, perhaps out of pity or a twisted sense of duty, had told him the truth. The siren was a call. The 5 minutes of hiding were a grace period. The tearing sound was the feeding. But the meal wasn't always wild animals. October 20th, he wrote, his handwriting becoming almost illegible. "The harvest. That's what she called it. It's not every time. Only every 2 years. In October. An appeasement," she said, "to ensure the town's prosperity, to keep the harmony. They give it something. Someone. An outsider. Someone who doesn't fit. Someone who asks too many questions. The corn husk figures aren't just good luck charms. They are effigies. Representations. They choose one, and they hang the doll on their door. It's a marker. A designation for the hunger." I dropped the journal. My eyes shot to the front porch, to the small, screaming man of woven husk that had been there since I arrived. It wasn't a welcome gift. It was a label. I was the offering. I was the next appeasement. I snatched the journal back up, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The last few pages were filled with frantic plans for escape, plans that were crossed out one by one. His car battery was dead. His tires were slashed. The phone lines were cut. His story was my own, playing out weeks ahead of me. The final entry was dated October 28th, 2 years ago. The whole town is outside. They're not looking at me with anger. It's worse. They're looking at me with a kind of placid reverence. Miller is at the front of the crowd. He's holding a length of rope. They're not going to kill me. They're just going to tie me to the old oak at the edge of the woods. They're going to leave me for the hum. It's not murder, you see. It's tradition. It's just something the town does. I can hear it now. Not the siren, not yet. But the low hum, starting in the earth, coming for. The sentence was unfinished. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. I stumbled to my study window and looked at the calendar on my desk. My finger traced the date. Tuesday, October 28th. The exact date of Elias Thorne's last entry, 2 years later. My 2-week grace period was over. This wasn't another siren day. This was the harvest. And as the full, horrifying weight of that realization crashed down upon me, I felt it. A low, deep vibration, starting in the soles of my feet and rising up through the floorboards. It was a familiar feeling, the feeling of the siren waking up. But this time I knew what it meant. It wasn't a dinner bell for some random beast. It was a personalized invitation, and my name was on the menu. The hum grew louder, the first note of the shriek beginning to form in the air, a clean, piercing sound that promised not just alarm, but annihilation. The siren's shriek was no longer just a sound in the air. It was a physical force, a needle of pure vibration driving into my skull. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. My limbs felt like lead. My thoughts fractured into 1,000 shards of terror. Through the window, I saw them. The people of Havenwood were emerging from their homes, but not to hide. They were gathering. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, their faces empty of emotion, their eyes fixed on my house. Sheriff Miller was at the front, a thick coil of rope in his hand. Beside him, Mr. Abernathy held a rusty-looking iron lantern. Mrs. Gable, Clara, the postman, they were all there, a silent, placid congregation assembling for a holy rite. Elias's final, unfinished sentence echoed, in my mind a coming for. They weren't going to break down the door and drag me out. That would be too chaotic, too disruptive to the harmony. They were going to wait. They would stand there, their collective will a tangible pressure, until I came out to meet my fate. The siren was for me. The 5-minute duration wasn't a grace period for them to hide. It was a countdown for me to surrender. My archivist's mind, so used to finding order in chaos, was failing me. There was no logic here, no record to consult, only the raw, primal truth of the journal, clutched in my hand. They're just going to tie me to the old oak. I wouldn't let that happen. I wouldn't be a placid sacrifice. My house backed onto the woods. It was my only chance. A desperate, suicidal gamble. To flee the shepherds and run directly into the wolf's maw. With a surge of adrenaline, fueled defiance, I scrambled for the back of the house. I could hear the floorboards of the front porch creaking as the first of them took up their positions. I fumbled with the lock on the kitchen door, my hands slick with sweat, and threw it open. I burst out into the cool October air and sprinted across the small, unkempt lawn towards the tree line. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see their faces, to see if they were pursuing me or simply watching, knowing the woods would do their work for them. I plunged into the forest just as the siren cut out. The silence that fell was instantaneous and absolute. It was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. Every sound I made, my ragged breaths, the snap of twigs under my feet, the frantic pounding of my own heart, was an obscenity in this sacred, hungry quiet. The woods were dark, the canopy of ancient pines swallowing the last of the afternoon light. I ran blindly, stumbling over roots, my face whipped by low, hanging branches. Then I heard it, not with my ears, but with my whole body. A low, rhythmic shifting. The wet, tearing sound from my memory, but magnified, closer. The air grew thick with the smell of damp soil, of rot, and the coppery tang of old blood. It was the smell of the earth itself turning over in its sleep, and it was waking up. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Through the trees, I could see the faint, flickering glow of Mr. Abernathy's lantern. They were following not with haste, but with the slow, inexorable patience of pallbearers. They were herding me deeper into the woods, towards the heart of the hunger. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, spongy, and unnaturally yielding. I looked down and saw that the soil was dark and loose, crawling with a lattice of pale, thick roots that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. I stumbled, catching myself on the trunk of a massive oak, the old oak from Elias's journal. Its bark was scarred with deep gouges, and dark stains soaked the earth around its base. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone that rose from the ground before me. It was the ground itself. Soil, leaf litter, and a writhing mass of pale roots coalesced, heaving upward into a form that was a grotesque parody of a man. It had no face, only a dark, gaping hollow where a mouth should be. Limbs of twisted wood and packed earth scraped against each other as it shambled towards me. The tearing sound, the friction of its own impossible body. It was the hum of the earth, the hunger of the wood, the guardian of Havenwood's terrible harmony. I was paralyzed, my defiance extinguished and replaced by a terror so profound it was almost transcendent. This was not a monster to be fought. It was a geological event. It was a fundamental law of this place, as inescapable as gravity. It reached for me with a limb of woven roots. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a knot of pure fear. As the roots touched my leg, I felt no pain, only a strange, pulling cold. The roots burrowed into my skin, not tearing, but merging. I felt myself being drawn down into the soft, hungry earth. My body began to come apart, not in a spray of blood and gore, but in a quiet, horrifying dissolution. My flesh became soil, my bones became roots, my blood became the dark sap of the forest. My consciousness, stretched thin and unraveling, was pulled into the collective. I felt Elias, Thorn there, and countless others before him, their terror and confusion a permanent echo in the soil. I felt the town, their placid satisfaction a distant, steady pulse. They were the keepers, we were the sustenance. This was the compact. This was the price of their peace. My last coherent thought was of the city I had fled. I had hated its noise, its chaos, its clamoring, vibrant life. I had come to Havenwood seeking quiet. As my vision dissolved into a swirling darkness of earth and root, and my sense of self was finally consumed by the great, silent hum, I realized I had found it. My name is Arthur Callahan. For the majority of my 42 years, I have been a creature of the city, a man defined by the steady rhythm of deadlines, the incessant hum of traffic, and the artificial glow of 1,000 computer screens. I worked as a senior archivist for a metropolitan museum, a profession that, while quiet, was steeped in the constant pressure of preservation, cataloging, and the meticulous management of human history. My world was one of climate, controlled vaults, and the scent of aging paper. It was a life of precision, of order, and of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. The decision to leave that world was not a sudden one. It was a slow erosion, a gradual wearing down of my spirit by the relentless pace of modern life. I found myself yearning for a silence that wasn't merely the absence of noise, but a presence in itself. I craved a darkness that wasn't simply a lack of light, but the deep, velvety black of a world untouched by electricity. I wanted, for the first time in my adult life, to be truly alone with my own thoughts. And so, after liquidating my modest assets and placing my professional life on an indefinite hiatus, I found myself applying for what many would consider a profoundly isolating position: a seasonal fire lookout for the U.S. Forest Service. The post was located deep within the sprawling, ancient heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, at a watchtower known simply as Thoroughfare Peak Tower. The interview process was surprisingly straightforward. A man named Ranger Davies, a portly fellow with a kind face and eyes that had seen more sunrises than I had seen late night television, seemed more interested in my psychological fortitude than my knowledge of fire suppression. "It's not for everyone, Arthur," he had said, leaning back in his creaky office chair, the scent of coffee and pine needles hanging in the air. "The solitude, it can play tricks on a man. You spend weeks on end with no one but the hawks and the wind for company. You start to see things, hear things. Your mind tries to fill the silence. I believe that's precisely what I'm looking for, sir," I had replied, my tone more confident than I felt. He nodded slowly, studying my face. "All right then. The post is yours if you want it. There's a bit of a unique protocol for this particular tower. The last fellow, a young man named Ben, left rather abruptly. Didn't even pack all his things. Said the place didn't agree with him. This gave me a moment's pause, but I dismissed it as the likely result of a city kid underestimating the reality of true isolation. I was not a kid. I was a man in search of quiet contemplation. I accepted the position. My journey to Thoroughfare Peak began a week later. The drive itself was a form of decompression. Paved highways gave way to state roads, which in turn narrowed into winding gravel tracks that clung precariously to the sides of mountains. The air grew cooler, cleaner, tasting of damp earth and pine. The last vestige of civilization was a small ranger station at the base of the mountain. However, where I was to meet another ranger who would guide me the rest of the way. His name was Earl, a man as weathered and sturdy as the ancient trees around us. He was tall and gaunt, with a leathery face and a grim set to his jaw that rarely softened. He drove an old, beaten, up Forest Service Jeep, and we ascended the final, rugged path in a series of bone-jarring lurches. "So, you're the new archivist?" he grunted, not taking his eyes off the treacherous track. He used the title of my former profession, not as a sign of respect, but as if it were a classification of a strange species. "Former archivist," I corrected. "Just Arthur now." He grunted again. "Up here, you're just lookout. Names don't mean much. Actions do." We didn't speak much for the rest of the journey. The forest grew denser, the canopy of leaves so thick that it cast the path in a perpetual twilight. The silence was profound, broken only by the groan of the Jeep's suspension and the occasional cry of a distant bird. It was exactly the kind of silence I had sought, yet it felt heavier, more watchful than I had anticipated. After another hour, the trees thinned, and we emerged into a clearing at the very summit of the peak. And there it was, Thoroughfare Peak Tower. It was a stark and lonely sentinel, a 90-foot, tall steel skeleton supporting a small square room at its apex. The steel was rusted to a deep, ruddy brown, and a single, dizzying spiral staircase wound its way up the exterior. It was both magnificent and terrifying, a fragile looking structure standing in defiance of the vast, rolling wilderness that stretched to every horizon. Earl killed the engine, and the silence rushed back in, absolute and all-encompassing. "Home sweet home," he said, without a trace of irony. We unloaded my supplies, boxes of non-perishable food, containers of water, books, and personal effects. Earl carried a heavy, looking pack of his own. We then began the long climb up the staircase. The wind picked up as we ascended, whistling through the steel girders and making the whole structure sway in a way that was deeply unsettling. I kept my eyes fixed on Earl's boots, not daring to look down. The room at the top, the cab, was a single 14 by 14-foot space enclosed on all four sides by large glass windows. In the center stood a circular map table, upon which was a detailed topographical map of the surrounding region, oriented and anchored under a glass plate. An Osborne fire finder, a complex brass instrument for pinpointing the location of smokes, sat upon it. Against one wall was a small cot, neatly made. Against another, a counter with a propane stove and a small sink. A short wave radio sat in one corner, its microphone hanging silently. And in another corner, a trapdoor in the floor, leading back down to the terrifying staircase. The view was breathtaking. A 360-degree panorama of the Smoky Mountains, an endless ocean of green and blue ridges, fading into a hazy, distant purple. It was a vista of raw, primordial beauty. For a moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. "All right, look out," Earl said, his voice pulling me from my reverie. He unslung his pack and pulled out a few items, a fresh logbook, a box of batteries for the radio, and a single, laminated sheet of paper. "You know the basics," he began, his tone all business. "Your job is to watch for smoke. You see any? You use the fire finder to get a bearing, estimate the distance, and radio it in to base. The radio is for official use only. Weather reports at 0800 and 2000 hours. You check and then, Every day. They'll check on you if you miss one. A supply team comes up once a month. Any questions on that? No. That seems clear. Good. He paused, then pushed the laminated sheet across the map table toward me. It was typed. The letters faded slightly. The plastic yellowed at the edges. It looked old, handled by many anxious hands. Now for the other stuff, he said, his voice lowering slightly. The tower's protocols. Ben, the kid before you, he thought they were a joke. He didn't last a week. You're an older fellow, a man of procedure. I'm hoping you'll have more sense. I picked up the sheet. The title was stark. Tho Raufar Piek Towar Mein Toar Operatin Ralis. I read the first rule, 1. The tower is to be occupied at all times. Do not, under any circumstances, leave the cab and descend the stairs between sunset and sunrise. No exceptions. I looked up at Earl. Seems a bit extreme. What if there's an emergency? There won't be, he said flatly. Not one that requires you to go down those stairs in the dark. I returned my gaze to the list. 2. You will see smoke that is not from a fire. You will see smoke that is the wrong color, blacker than pitch, or the color of a fresh bruise. You are to report all smokes, but note the unusual ones in the logbook with a single asterisk. Do not speculate on their source over the radio. Wrong color smoke. I asked, a small knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. You'll know it when you see it, Earl said, his face unreadable. Just log it. 3. The forest is not quiet. You will hear sounds. If you hear something that sounds like a person calling your name, you did not. It is the wind playing tricks in the valleys. Do not answer. Do not acknowledge it. My mouth was suddenly dry. I thought of Ranger Davies's warning. Your mind tries to fill the silence. This rule felt different. It was too specific. 4. The radio is for scheduled communications only. If you receive a call outside of the 0800s or 2000 check-ins, do not respond. This is especially true for calls received after midnight. It is not the ranger station. Who would it be? I whispered, the question feeling foolish as soon as I asked it. Earl just shook his head. Doesn't matter who it is. What matters is that you don't answer. I forced myself to continue reading, a sense of unreality beginning to creep over me. This felt less like a set of safety protocols, and more like the rules to a game I didn't understand. 5. From time to time, you may observe a sequence of lights hovering over the ridge to the north, known as Old Crow's Ridge. They may be bright and multicolored. Do not look at them directly. Observe them only through your peripheral vision. Do not log them. Do not report them. They are a localized atmospheric phenomenon. Localized atmospheric phenomenon. I read aloud, my voice laced with skepticism. That's not a scientific term. It's the term we use, Earl said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The list went on, each rule stranger and more unnerving than the last. 6. If, while scanning the tree line, you see a stationary human figure standing at the edge of the woods, do not stare at it. Avert your gaze. Continue your scan as normal. It will not be there when you look back. It is a trick of the light. 7. On the third night of your stay, and every third night thereafter, you must lock the trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs before sunset using the heavy bolt. You will hear knocking. You may hear scratching. You may hear pleading. You are to ignore it until sunrise. The bolt must hold. A cold dread, sharp and piercing, shot through me. Pleading, "Earl, what the hell is this? Is this some kind of hazing ritual for new lookouts?" For the first time, Earl's grim facade cracked. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not malice or amusement, but a deep, wary pity. "I wish it was sun. I truly do," he said softly. "I've been with the service for 35 years. I've seen things in these mountains that don't make sense. Things that don't follow the rules of the world you and I know. This tower, this peak, it's one of the places where the rules are thin. That list," he tapped the laminated sheet, "is how you survive here. The rules are not suggestions. They are absolutes. You break them, and I'll be driving another replacement up here in a week. If we're lucky enough to find what's left of you to replace." The finality in his voice was absolute. This was not a joke. He gathered his empty pack. "My advice, Arthur, don't try to understand it. Don't try to rationalize it. Just accept it. Do your job, follow the rules, and you'll be fine. You'll see some beautiful sunrises." He moved to the trapdoor. "I'll be back in a month with your supplies. Radio in at 2,000 hours. And with that, he was gone, his heavy boots clanging on the steel steps, the sound growing fainter and fainter, until it was swallowed by the wind. A few minutes later, I heard the distant groan of his Jeep's engine, and then nothing. I was alone. I stood in the center of the cab for a long time, the laminated sheet clutched in my hand. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and crimson. The beauty of it was immense, but now it was tainted by a creeping sense of menace. The shadows of the mountains stretched and deepened, and the endless sea of trees began to look less like a forest and more like a dark, waiting ocean. I was a man of logic, of archives and evidence. My mind desperately sought rational explanations. The rules were a psychological test, a prank, the product of a lonely man's madness, passed down through generations of lookouts. But Earl's sincerity had been undeniable. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared, below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep twilight, I walked over to the trapdoor and looked down the spiral staircase. The world below was a pit of ink. I thought of Rule Fate 1. With a trembling hand, I closed the heavy trapdoor, the sound echoing in the small cab. I turned and faced the windows, my own pale, anxious face reflected in the glass. Outside, the Smoky Mountains sat in an ancient, profound silence, and I had the distinct and terrifying feeling that I was being watched. The first night had begun. The first 48 hours passed in a state of hyper-vigilant routine. My life, once dictated by the chime of email, notifications, and the rigid schedule of museum hours, found a new, more primal rhythm. It was governed by the rising and setting of the sun, the slow sweep of my binoculars across the endless canopy of trees, and the crackle of the radio at precisely 002,000 hours. During the day, the tower felt like a sanctuary. The sun would burn away the morning mist, revealing the staggering, breathtaking beauty of the Smokies. I was an emperor in a glass castle, monarch of all I surveyed. I followed my duties with the same meticulous precision I had applied to cataloging ancient artifacts. I would make a slow 360-degree scan of the horizon every 15 minutes, my eyes tracing the ridges and valleys for the faintest whisper of smoke. I made notes in the fresh logbook Earl had provided, detailing wind speed, cloud cover, and visibility. The entries were crisp, professional, and utterly devoid of the yawing anxiety that took root in my soul the moment the sun began to dip below the horizon. Night was a different entity altogether. When darkness fell, the glass walls of the cab ceased to be windows onto a majestic world. They became mirrors, reflecting my own solitary, haunted face with a vast, unknowable blackness pressing in from all sides. The profound silence I had craved became a physical weight. Every creak of the steel tower in the wind, every skittering sound on the roof that was likely just an insect or a fallen leaf, became amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. I slept fitfully on the small cot, the laminated list of rules on the small table beside me, a talisman against the encroaching dread. I tried to rationalize the rules, to file them away in the logical cabinets of my mind. Rule 51, not leaving after sunset, was simple prudence. A fall from that height in the dark would be fatal. The others were surely the products of isolation-induced paranoia, codified and passed down as a kind of morbid tradition. Tricks of the light, the wind playing games in the complex topography, the mind's desperate attempt to create patterns from chaos. This was the narrative I clung to. It was a thin blanket against a bone, deep chill. The first test of my resolve came on the afternoon of the second day. I was scanning the eastern quadrant, a vast expanse of old-growth forest. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. And then I saw it, a plume of smoke, rising from a deep valley about 10 miles out. I reached for the radio, my training kicking in, but then I paused. I focused my binoculars on the smoke, and my blood ran cold. It was the wrong color. It wasn't the gray or white of a typical forest fire, nor the greasy black of a chemical fire. It was a sickening, bruised purple, the color of a deep contusion. It didn't drift and dissipate on the wind. It pulsed, coiling and uncoiling in the air, like a malevolent serpent of vapor rising from the depths of the forest. My mind recoiled. It was impossible. Smoke did not behave that way. It did not hold that color. I remembered Rule 8-2. You will see smoke that is not from a fire. Report all smokes, but note the unusual ones in the logbook with a single asterisk. My hand trembled as I keyed the microphone. Thoroughfare peak to base, over. The familiar, grounding voice of Ranger Davies crackled back. Go ahead, Thoroughfare. We read you. Base, I have a smoke sighting. Bearing 290 degrees from my position. Estimated distance 10 miles. I described the location, my voice a mask of calm professionalism. I did not mention the color. I did not mention the way it seemed to breathe. Copy that, Thoroughfare. We'll send a spotter plane to check it out. Good eye, Arthur. Thoroughfare, clear. I hung up the microphone, my body slick with a cold sweat. I turned to the logbook. With a shaking pen, I recorded the time, the bearing, and the estimated distance. And then, next to the entry, I drew a single, small asterisk. It seemed to stare up at me from the page. A tiny black star of wrongness. I spent the rest of the day watching the purple smoke. It never spread. It simply pulsed in place for 3 more hours before slowly, inexplicably, sinking back down into the trees and vanishing, if it had never been. The spotter plane reported nothing. That night, sleep offered no escape. My dreams were of coiling, purple tendrils and the suffocating scent of decay. I awoke just before dawn to a new sound, one that was not on the list. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the glass of the window directly behind my head. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, patient. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming. I was 90 feet in the air. Nothing could be tapping on my window. A bird, I told myself. A large moth drawn to the faint light of my lantern. But the sound was too heavy, too intentional. Tap, tap, tap. I remembered Earl's advice. Don't try to understand it. Just accept it. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the thin blanket over my head. I focused on the sound of my own frantic heartbeat, using it to drown out the impossible tapping from the other side of the glass. It continued for what felt like an eternity, before finally fading away with the first gray light of dawn. I did not look to see what, if anything, was there. The morning of the third day dawned gray and oppressive. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, blanketing the world and reducing my visibility to less than 50 feet. The tower felt like an island in a sea of nothingness. The isolation was now absolute. It was on this morning, while searching for something to distract my frayed nerves, that I found the old logbooks. They were stored in a wooden chest beneath the cot. There were 5 of them, their leather covers cracked and faded. The most recent one, on top, was Ben's, the young man who had left in a hurry. His entries began much like my own, neat, professional, full of observations about the weather and the stunning beauty of the landscape. Then, about a week in, the tone began to shift. October 3. Saw the bruise smoke today. Called it in. Davy said the plane saw nothing. I know what I saw. Put the star next to it, like the old-timer said. A few pages later, October 6. Third night. Locked the door. The knocking started right after sunset. It's not the wind. It sounds like knuckles on wood. I'm trying to read, but the sound is distracting. His handwriting grew more erratic. October 9. It was pleading tonight. Used a little girl's voice. Said she was lost and cold. I almost opened the door. God help me, I almost did. The bolt held. October 10. There was a man at the tree line this morning. Just standing there. Rule phase 6. Didn't stare. Looked away, scanned the ridge. Looked back. He was gone. But I can still feel his eyes on me. He wasn't made of light. He was real. His final entry was a frantic scrawl covering half a page. October 12. IT Kaladimi on THE Radio. Now to device. THE Vice was W Orange. Day up. Tio Kmayenea. ITK EMMY star. How keldi ITK no ABOUMY I star. I'm a VNG. I'm a Nambu. I daf I test die IHT. I kinda star in EGHT. Do and I sta tutu HE radio intermedian IGHT. IT cetera. T-say trap. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was all real. Every insane, impossible rule was a literal warning. Ben hadn't been a weak city kid. He had been a man who had stared into the abyss and fled. I spent the next hour reading entries from the older logbooks going back decades. The stories were all the same, written in different hands but telling a single, consistent tale of wrong. Colored smoke of disembodied voices, of lights on Old Crow's Ridge, and of the terrible, cyclical knocking on the third night. As the afternoon wore on, the fog began to thin, but the sky remained a leaden gray. The world outside was muted and colorless. A profound sense of dread settled over me. Today was my third day. Tonight was my third night. I remembered Rule Phase 7. On the third night of your stay, you must lock the trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs before sunset, using the heavy bolt. My earlier confusion about the rule's wording now seemed like a cruel joke. There was no trapdoor at the bottom of the stairs. There was only the heavy steel door that provided the only entrance to the tower's base. And there was the trapdoor in the floor of the cab, my only way down. The rule was a contradiction, a choice. Did I break Rule 81 and descend the stairs to lock the bottom door, exposing myself to whatever was out there? Or did I stay in the cab, assuming the rule meant the trapdoor right here, and hope that was enough? I looked at the heavy bolt on the trapdoor in the floor. It was thick, rusted steel. It looked like it could hold against a battering. Then, I looked at the logbooks, at Ben's frantic warnings. He had locked the door. Plurality suggested he meant the one in the cab. That had to be it. The rule was poorly phrased, but its intent was clear: secure your immediate location. Going down was suicide. As the sun, a pale, sickly disk in the gray sky, finally touched the horizon, I made my decision. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the bolt on the trapdoor in the floor. It was heavy and stiff from disuse. With a final, desperate heave, I shot it home. The solid thunk of the steel bolt, seating in its iron bracket, was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard. I was sealed in. I made my 2,000 hours radio call, my voice tight but steady. Ranger Davies wished me a quiet night. I wished I could believe him. I tried to read, but the words swam before my eyes. The cab grew cold, the propane lantern casting long, dancing shadows. The silence outside was absolute, the fog having muffled all the normal sounds of the forest. It was a dead, waiting silence. And then it began. It started not as a knock, but as a faint, rhythmic scratching. It came from directly below, from the other side of the trapdoor. Scry-ape, scrape, scry-ape. It was the sound of fingernails, or perhaps claws, being dragged slowly and deliberately across the thick wood. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the trapdoor, my eyes wide with terror, pressing myself into the far corner of the cab. The scratching stopped. For a long, heart-stopping moment, there was only silence. Then came the knocking. Knuk, seek, knoke. It was not the sound of human knuckles. It was heavy, solid, powerful. Each impact vibrated through the floor, up my legs, and into my teeth. It was a sound of immense strength and implacable will. It wanted in. I stared at the heavy bolt on the trapdoor, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that it would hold. The knocking stopped again. A new sound filled the silence. A voice. A sweet, high-pitched voice of a little girl, muffled by the door. "Mister, can you let me in? I'm lost, and I'm so cold." My blood turned to ice. It was exactly as Ben had written. My mind screamed at me. It's a trick. It's not real. Rule Phase 7. Ignore it. But the voice was so pathetic, so filled with genuine terror, that a sliver of doubt, a shard of my former rational self, pierced through my fear. What if it was real? What if a child had somehow wandered up this mountain? "Please," the voice cried, now with a desperate sob. "My daddy went to find help, but he's been gone so long. I can hear things in the woods. Please, just open the door." The pleading tore at me. It was the most terrible sound I had ever heard. I was a man of procedure, of rules. And the rules were the only thing keeping me alive. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands over my ears, but I could not block out the sound of the child's weeping from beneath my feet. And then the voice changed. The sweet, childish pleading warped, dropping in pitch, becoming guttural, monstrous, and filled with an ancient, bottomless rage. I kano u or e the, it boomed, the sound so powerful it shook the very glass in the windows. O pentiches do ar shechivist. Lewit mel ko am. The voice, that booming, cavernous voice that called me archivist, shattered the last vestiges of my rational mind. It was a sledgehammer to the foundations of my reality. Terror, pure and undiluted, is a surprisingly clarifying emotion. In that single moment, all my attempts to explain away the rules as psychological quirks or morbid traditions evaporated. This was not a trick of the wind. This was not a product of my own isolated mind. There was something beneath my feet, something ancient and intelligent, and filled with a rage that felt as old as the mountains themselves. And it knew me. That was the detail that unspooled my sanity. How could it know my former profession? I had been Arthur Callahan, senior archivist, for 2 decades. It was a title, a definition, a box I had placed myself in. The voice used the word archivist, not as a job title, but as an accusation. And its demand, LTMSCEOUR was nonsensical and yet terrifyingly specific. My collection was of dust and paper, of carefully preserved historical documents, locked away in a climate-controlled vault hundreds of miles away. What could this creature possibly want with that? The booming voice did not speak again, but the knocking resumed with a renewed, terrifying violence. It was no longer a simple kaok. K-no-seek, K-no-seek. It was a frantic, furious pounding that shook the entire tower. The floor beneath my feet vibrated with each blow, and I could hear the steel frame of the structure groaning in protest. The propane lantern flickered wildly, casting my spastic shadow against the glass walls. I was a caged animal, and the predator was trying to smash its way in. I scrambled to the farthest corner of the cab, curling into a fetal position with my hands clamped over my ears. It did little to block out the concussive impacts from below. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to recite the only things I could think of that represented order and logic. archival cataloging numbers, the Dewey Decimal System, the chemical formulas for paper preservation. It was a litany of a life that no longer existed, a desperate prayer to the God of reason, in a place where reason had died. The assault on the trapdoor continued for hours. It was relentless. Just when I thought it was beginning to fade, it would return with even greater fury. I lost all track of time, adrift in a sea of pure terror. The only thing that mattered was the integrity of the thick wooden door and the rusted steel bolt that held it shut. I prayed it would hold. I prayed for the dawn. And finally, after an eternity of noise and fear, the first gray, watery light of morning began to seep over the eastern ridges. As the light grew, the violent knocking subsided, replaced once more by the soft, insidious scratching. The scratching continued for another 10 minutes, a final, hateful promise, before it too faded away into silence. Silence, it was no longer a thing I craved. It was a void, a space where the horror had been and could return at any moment. I remained huddled in the corner for a full hour, after the sun had risen, too afraid to move. The fog from the previous day had burned off. The world outside was painfully beautiful, the valleys filled with a soft, white mist that looked like freshly fallen snow. It was a world that could not, contain the thing that had tormented me all night. Eventually, trembling and exhausted, I forced myself to my feet. My legs were stiff, my muscles screaming in protest. I crept towards the trapdoor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knelt, my ear pressed against the wood. Nothing. Only the faint whisper of the wind outside. With a shaking hand, I reached for the bolt. It was still firmly in place. I slid it back, the sound of metal on metal grating in the quiet cab. I hesitated for a long moment, my hand on the iron ring that served as a handle. What if it was waiting just below? What if opening the door was the final mistake? But I had to know. I had to see. I lifted the trapdoor an inch and peered through the crack. Nothing but the top steps of the spiral staircase, lit by the morning sun. I opened it fully and looked down. The staircase was empty. The steel door at the base of the tower was closed. There was no sign of anything amiss. But then I looked at the trapdoor itself. The underside, the thick oak that had faced the assault, was a ruin. It was covered in deep, gouging scratches, not the thin lines of fingernails, but the thick, splintering furrows that could only have been made by something immensely strong and sharp. And in the center of the door, where the knocking had been most focused, the wood was dented and cracked, the fibers crushed inwards. Physical evidence, undeniable proof. My rational mind, the archivist within me, seized on it. This was real. This happened. And the rules were the only thing that had saved me. The next 2 days were a blur of fearful vigilance. I was no longer a man seeking quiet contemplation. I was a prisoner on watch duty. I performed my scans, logged the weather, and made my radio check-ins with a mechanical, robotic precision. But my mind was elsewhere. It was replaying the sounds from the third night. It was contemplating the impossible, knowledge the creature possessed. My relationship with the tower had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, suspended 90 feet in the air, and I was the bait. The vast, beautiful wilderness was no longer a landscape of primordial beauty. It was a hunting ground, and I was the prey. On the afternoon of the 5th day, I experienced another rule firsthand. I was scanning the tree line to the south, the sun warm on the glass. My eyes were tired, my nerves raw, and then I saw him, just as Rule 86 had described. A stationary human figure, standing at the very edge of the woods, partially obscured by the trunk of a massive pine tree. He was too far away to make out any details, even with the binoculars. He was just a silhouette, a man-shaped patch of darkness, against the dappled green of the forest. My immediate instinct was to stare, to focus my binoculars and try to identify him. A lost hiker, perhaps. A hunter. But Ben's frantic scrawl echoed in my mind. He wasn't made of light. He was real. And the cold, imperative text of the rule: do not stare at it. Avert your gaze. Continue your scan as normal. It will not be there when you look back. My heart hammered in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to keep watching, to assess the potential threat. But the memory of the splintered trapdoor was still fresh. The rules were not suggestions. They were survival commands. With a supreme act of will, I forced myself to move the binoculars, to continue my scan to the left, away from the figure. My hands were shaking so badly that the image through the lenses was a blur. I swept my gaze across the next ridge, my mind screaming. I counted to 30, the seconds stretching into an eternity. I noted a hawk circling on a thermal. I logged it. Normal scan. Everything is normal. Then, with my stomach in a tight, cold knot, I slowly panned back to the spot where the figure had been. It was empty. There was only the pine tree and the deep shadows of the forest behind it. He was gone. There was no way a person could have moved that quickly, that silently, without my seeing. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. But I knew he had been there. And worse, I had the chilling, unshakable feeling that he knew I had seen him. The feeling of being watched, which had been a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, was now a piercing shriek in the forefront of my mind. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the map table, the lantern turned down low, staring out into the blackness. The 6th day was approaching. The second cycle of the 3rd night. The dread was a physical thing, a sour taste in the back of my throat. Would it be the same? The scratching, the knocking, the little girl's voice? Or would it escalate? The logbooks had been consistent, but they were also records of men who had survived. What about the ones who hadn't? What had they experienced? As the sun set on the evening of the 6th day, the sky was a bloody, bruised red. It felt like an omen. I performed my ritual. I made my 2,000 hours radio call, my voice a strained whisper. And then, with a sense of grim ceremony, I shot the heavy bolt on the trapdoor. The thunk of the steel was no longer a comfort. It was the sound of a tomb being sealed. I waited. The silence in the cab was absolute. An hour passed. Then 2. Nothing. A sliver of hope, fragile and foolish, began to grow in my chest. Maybe it only happened once. Maybe, having failed, It had moved on. And then the radio crackled to life. My head snapped towards it. It was 2247. Not a scheduled check-in. My blood ran cold. Rule Fe 4. If you receive a call outside of the 0800 or 2000 check-ins, do not respond. This is especially true for calls received after midnight. It wasn't after midnight yet. A part of my mind, the desperate, hopeful part, clung to that detail. Maybe it was a real emergency. Thoroughfare Peak, this is base. Arthur, do you read me? Over. It was Ranger Davies's voice. It sounded exactly like him. The same calm, reassuring tone. But there was something wrong. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss underneath his words, like static, but wet. I stared at the microphone, my hand hovering over it. Ben's warning screamed in my head. IT Kaladion Hirato. THV Dasuraonji. Arthur, please respond. The radio crackled again. We have a situation. Earl, there's been an accident. He was coming up to check on you. His Jeep went off the road. We need to know if you saw anything. Over. My world tilted. Earl, an accident. A wave of guilt and fear washed over me. What if this was real? What if my silence condemned him? But the rule was absolute. I stayed silent, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the map table. A long pause. Then, the voice from the radio spoke again. The calm, reassuring tone was gone. It was replaced by a low, mocking chuckle. The wet, hissing static grew louder. Oh, Arthur. The voice, no longer Davies's, crooned. It was the same deep, resonant voice from beneath the trapdoor. The good little archivist. Always following the rules. But rules can be rewritten. Collections can be recatalogued. And then, from the radio, it began to speak of things it could not possibly know. It spoke of my quiet, lonely childhood. It spoke of the day my father left, the memory I had buried for 30 years. It described the pattern on the wallpaper in my childhood bedroom. It was inside my head. It was pulling the memories out, one by one, like artifacts from a dusty box, examining them, and then holding them up to mock me. I stumbled back from the radio, a strangled cry escaping my lips. And as I did, the scratching began on the trapdoor below my feet, louder this time, more frantic. And from outside, from the inky blackness beyond the glass, I heard a sound that made my soul turn to ice. It was the sound of a single, heavy footstep on the steel staircase just below the cab. Seelange. It was climbing. The sound was a physical blow. It was the sound of finality, the tolling of a bell for my sanity. My carefully constructed reality, already fractured and splintered, shattered into a million pieces. The scratching below. The mocking voice from the radio. They were distractions, a multi-pronged assault designed to paralyze me. The true threat was no longer trying to get in. It was already here. It was on the stairs. My breath hitched in a silent scream. I scrambled backwards, my back hitting the cold glass of the northern window. My eyes darted wildly between the trapdoor. Now, vibrating with the furious scratching from whatever remained below, and the radio, which had fallen silent, its malevolent work done. But my hearing was focused entirely on the outside. Seelang, another step, slower this time, heavier. The sound of steel groaning under a weight. It was never designed to bear. It was a deliberate, measured tread, the sound of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. There was no rush. It had all the time in the world. I was in a glass box, 90 feet in the air. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. My former life, the quiet, ordered world of the archivist, seemed like a dream I'd once had. That man was gone. In his place was a terrified animal, heart hammering, every nerve ending screaming, sea lamen. It was higher now, maybe halfway up. The entire tower swayed with each step, a slow, sickening motion. I gripped the frame of the window to steady myself, my knuckles white. The voice on the radio had burrowed into my mind. But this was a more primal fear. This was the fear of being physically torn apart. I had to look. I couldn't just wait here in the dark, listening to my doom approach. I had to see what was coming for me. With a surge of adrenaline, fueled desperation, I crawled towards the western window, the one overlooking the top of the spiral staircase. The scratching from the trapdoor intensified, as if sensing my movement. Angry that my attention was shifting, I pressed my face to the cold glass, my breath fogging a small patch before me. I peered down into the inky blackness. At first, I saw nothing but the faint, skeletal outline of the stairs against the star-dusted sky. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows below. It was not a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs moving with a disjointed, unnatural grace. It didn't climb the stairs like a person, placing one foot after another. It flowed upwards, pulling its grotesque length from then, step to the next in a single, fluid motion, its form seeming to stretch and contract like cooling tar. It was the silhouette from the tree line, the man-shaped patch of darkness, but now it was in motion, and it was coming for me. As it drew closer, I could see that its form was not solid. It was a vortex of deeper blackness, its edges indistinct and wavering, seeming to absorb the faint starlight around it. There were no discernible features. No face, no clothes, no hands. Only a horrifying, shifting anatomy that my mind could not properly process. It was a living shadow, a tear in the fabric of the night. It reached the landing just below the cab. It stopped. For a terrifying moment, it was perfectly still. I could feel its attention, a palpable pressure against the glass, a cold, dead focus that was far more terrifying than any scream. The scratching beneath my feet stopped. The tower fell silent, save for the whisper of the wind and the frantic drumming of my own heart. Then, it raised a long, multi-jointed limb and tapped on the glass. Tap, a single, soft, almost polite sound. It was a mockery of the frantic pounding on the trapdoor. It was the sound of absolute confidence. I recoiled from the window, crab walking backwards until I hit the map table. My mind was a maelstrom of terror. I was going to die. The glass would shatter, and that thing would pour into the cab. My wild eyes fell upon the laminated list of rules, lying on the table next to the logbook. My sanctuary of rules had failed. They had kept me alive for 6 days. But now the monster was at the door. Tap. Tap. It was testing the glass, its touch sending tiny vibrations through the floor. The sound was maddeningly gentle. My gaze fell on Rule 25. From time to time, you may observe a sequence of lights hovering over the ridge to the north, known as Old Crow's Ridge. Do not look at them directly. They are a localized atmospheric phenomenon. A localized atmospheric phenomenon. Earl's flat, unconvincing explanation. Ben had never mentioned the lights in his logbook. Maybe they hadn't appeared for him. Or maybe they were the key. A desperate, insane idea began to form in my shattered mind. What if the rules weren't just a list of prohibitions? What if they were instructions? What if the phenomenon was a weapon? I scrambled to the northern window, my back to the tapping creature. I stared out at the dark, jagged line of Old Crow's Ridge. It was just a black shape against a blacker sky. Nothing. The tapping on the western window stopped. I heard a soft, slithering sound, the noise of something immense dragging itself across the narrow, metal catwalk that encircled the cab. It was moving. It was coming around to the front. My eyes were glued to the northern ridge, praying for a miracle I couldn't even define. "Please," I whispered to the indifferent darkness. "Please." And then it happened. A single point of brilliant, emerald green light appeared above the ridge. It was utterly silent, impossibly bright. A moment later, a second light appeared next to it, a deep, vibrant sapphire. Then a third, the color of blood. They hovered in a perfect, straight line, pulsing with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Rule 25 screamed in my head. Do not look at them directly. I tore my gaze away. My eyes smarting, spots of color dancing in my vision. The slithering sound outside had stopped. I risked a glance at the window where the shadow thing had been. It was gone. I turned back to the northern window, but kept my eyes averted, focusing on the reflection of the cab in the glass. In the reflection, I could see the thing. It was plastered against the southern window now, its form flattened and spread across the entire pane of glass like a giant black insect. And it was no longer looking at me. Its entire, featureless being seemed to be focused on the northern ridge, on the lights. It seemed afraid. The lights began to move. They broke their perfect formation and began to dance, weaving intricate, geometric patterns in the sky. They were beautiful and terrifying, a silent, cosmic ballad. As they danced, they grew brighter, their collective glow beginning to illuminate the interior of the cab. The creature on the window began to recoil. A low, guttural hiss emanated from it, a sound of pain and fury that vibrated through the glass. Its form started to waver, to lose its cohesion, as if the light were dissolving it. A desperate gamble, a choice. The rules were all I had. I remembered the Osborne Firefinder on the map table, its polished brass surface a perfect, convex mirror. Without looking up, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor, I lunged for the Firefinder. I angled its mirrored surface towards the northern window, catching the reflection of the dancing lights. Then I turned, aiming the reflected light like a weapon towards the southern window, where the creature was writhing. The moment the reflected, concentrated light hit the black form, it shrieked. It was not a sound made of air and vocal cords. It was a psychic scream that tore through my mind, a sound of pure agony and hatred. The creature convulsed violently, its form boiling and coming apart like ink in water. It detached from the glass and flung itself from the catwalk, a comet of dissolving shadow, plummeting into the darkness below. I collapsed to the floor, the firefinder clattering from my grasp. The psychic scream echoed in my skull. The lights over Old Crow's Ridge held. For another minute, their silent dance, reaching a final, brilliant crescendo, before winking out, one by one, plunging the world back into darkness. Silence. This time, the silence was real. The scratching was gone. The voice was gone. The thing on the stairs was gone. I was alone. Truly alone. I lay on the floor until the sun rose, a broken man in a glass box. The dawn was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It wasn't just the end of the night. It was a confirmation that I had survived. When I finally found the strength to stand, I surveyed the cab. The trapdoor was savaged, the wood splintered and gouged. The glass on the southern window was smeared with a black, viscous residue that sizzled faintly in the morning light, before evaporating into a foul, smelling vapor. I was alive. The rules had saved me. But I understood now. They weren't just a list of warnings for a passive observer. They were the terms of engagement in a war I hadn't known I was fighting. This tower wasn't a prison. It was a listening post, a watchtower, an outpost on the front line, and the voice on the radio. "Let me see your collection, archivist." My eyes fell to the chest under the cot, the one containing the old logbooks. Ben's frantic scrawl. The methodical entries of the men who came before him. Decades of testimony. A collection of witness statements. An archive of the impossible. That was my collection. That was what the darkness wanted. It didn't just want to kill the lookout. It wanted to erase the knowledge, to silence the witnesses, to wipe the official record clean. It wanted to make the history of this place disappear. I walked over to the chest and opened it. I took out the fresh logbook Earl had given me. I opened it to a new page. My hand was steady now. The fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in my gut, but it was overlaid with something new, a grim, resolute purpose. I was Arthur Callahan. I was the lookout. But that booming, monstrous voice had been right about one thing. I am the archivist, and my work has just begun. My name is Alex Thorne. As a protection ranger with the National Park Service, my jurisdiction is the vast, often unforgiving wilderness of Olympic National Park. For nearly a decade, my duties have been a mix of law enforcement, emergency response, and resource management. You learn to read the forest, to understand its rhythms. But more importantly, you learn to read the silence when it's wrong. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late October. The rain was relentless. We soon discovered why. A steady drumming on the roof of the ranger station that had been the soundtrack to my life for the past week. Dispatch patched through a woman named Clara West from Portland. Her voice was tight with a carefully controlled panic that I recognized instantly. Her brother, Julian, was overdue. He'd gone into the hall for a 3-day solo hike, a trip he'd made half a dozen times before. He was supposed to have checked in the previous evening. He hadn't. My mind immediately began running through the checklist. The first steps of any SAR operation. I needed to determine the search urgency. Julian was experienced, he was well equipped, and the weather, while miserable, wasn't life-threatening for a prepared hiker. But he was alone. That elevated the urgency. "Mom, I'm going to ask you a series of questions," I said, pulling up the digital version of the lost person questionnaire on my monitor. It's a document we use to build a profile, to get inside the head of the person we're looking for. I started with the basics. Julian West, age 28, 5'11", 175 pounds, athletic build, brown hair, blue eyes. Clara confirmed his trip plan. A 3-day solo photography, hike starting on the Ho River Trail, aiming for 5 Mile Island and back. While she spoke, I radioed dispatch to have a patrol check the visitor center lot. The confirmation came back in minutes. Julian's blue Subaru Forester was there, cold and quiet under a film of rain. Every piece of data is a breadcrumb that might lead us to him. Does he have any known medical conditions? I asked. Any history of depression? Any personal problems he might be trying to get away from? No, nothing like that, Clara said, her voice wavering slightly. He loves it out there. It's his happy place. He's a photographer. He just posted something yesterday afternoon. It was the last I heard from him. My fingers paused over the keyboard. A social media post. Can you tell me what it was? A picture, she said. It was strange. I didn't know what to make of it. Can you describe it for me? There was a pause, and I could hear her scrolling on her phone. It's a staircase. Just a set of stairs in the middle of the woods. They're white and they look perfectly clean, like they don't belong there. They just go up and stop. They lead to nowhere. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I'd heard the stories. Every ranger has. Campfire tales, internet creepypastas shared by seasonal staff, the weird, unsettling phenomenon of staircases, found deep in national forests where no structure had ever stood. They were a modern myth, a spooky story for a dark night. They weren't supposed to be real. What was the caption? Mince. West. Her voice was barely a whisper. He wrote, found something that shouldn't be here. The geometry is all wrong. She took a shaky breath. The geo tag was corrupted. It just shows a string of errors. I finished the report, my movements feeling stiff and automatic. The objective facts of the case were now contaminated by something irrational, something that had no place in an official document. But it was the last point of contact. It was the key piece of evidence. I assembled my hasty team myself, a younger ranger named Ben Carter, and a volunteer, Maria Diaz, both sharp, fit, and well trained. We geared up and headed out. The moment we stepped from the trailhead into the forest proper, the world changed. The sound of the rain was different here, muffled by the thick canopy. The light filtered down in a diffuse, lurid green, making everything look sickly and submerged. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of damp earth and decay. We moved fast, our boots sinking into the soft mulch of the forest floor. But as we pushed deeper, an unnatural quiet began to settle around us. The normal chatter of the forest, the scolding of a squirrel, the call of a Steller's jay, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, was gone. There was only the drip of water from the massive ferns and the sound of our own breathing. It was a silence that felt active, a silence that was listening. I've spent my life in the woods, and I know the difference between quiet and the profound, oppressive stillness that comes when a predator is near. The forest was holding its breath. It felt like we were being watched, not by an animal, but by the trees themselves, by the ancient, silent intelligence of the place. We found Julian's pack about 4 miles in, 100 yards off the main trail, dropped next to a colossal nurse log that looked like the fossilized spine of some long, dead leviathan. This was his point last seen. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but a thick, cold fog was rolling in from the west, swallowing the forest and shrinking our world to a radius of 50 feet. Visibility dropped to near zero. The air grew colder. "Fan out," I ordered, my voice sounding small and thin in the immense quiet. Eyes open. He can't be far. Ben moved to my left, Maria to my right, our headlamps cutting uselessly into the swirling gray. And then Ben stopped. He didn't call out, just froze. I moved toward his position, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What is it?" "Ben." He just raised a hand and pointed. I followed his gaze and my blood ran cold. There, in a small, unnaturally clear patch of ground, was the staircase. It was exactly as Clara had described it, made of a smooth, white material that looked like bleached bone or marble. It rose out of the mossy earth, pristine and utterly alien. It was untouched by the rain, free of the moss and grime that coated every other surface in this forest. It consisted of 12 steps leading up to a small platform that opened into nothing but empty, gray fog. It was an object of impossible logic, a wound in the fabric of the world. We stood there, the three of us, paralyzed. My training, my experience, my carefully constructed rational view of the world. It all dissolved in the face of that silent, inexplicable thing. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in on us from all sides. It was the forest, the stillness where the trees watch. And we had just walked into its parlor. For a long moment, none of us moved. The world had shrunk to this single, impossible tableau. 3 search and rescue personnel, frozen in the mist, staring at a structure that defied all logic. My training screamed at me to act, to impose order on the chaos. But my instincts were screaming something else, entirely run. It was the classic psychological split you hear about in survival situations. The rational mind wrestling with pure, primal fear. One part of me was cataloging the scene, unidentified structure, potential evidence, proximity to the point last seen, while the other was simply drowning in the sheer wrongness of it all. "Thorn, what is this?" Maria's voice was tight, strained. She was a rock, usually. A volunteer with more field hours than some of our paid staff, but her composure was cracking. I forced myself to breathe, the cold, damp air stinging my lungs. "I don't know," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Treat it as a potential crime scene. Ben photos everything. Wide shots, close, ups on the base, the steps. Maria, start a slow, circular sweep. Look for footprints, drag marks, anything. My orders were a lifeline back to the world of procedure and protocol. A way to fend off the encroaching panic. Ben fumbled with the weatherproof camera, his hands shaking slightly. Maria nodded, her eyes still fixed on the staircase as she unclipped her GPS to mark the location. The silence pressed in again, heavier than before. It wasn't just the absence of animal sounds anymore. It felt like the air itself was absorbing noise, muffling our movements, swallowing our words. It was a phenomenon I'd read about in accounts of extreme isolation. The sensed presence, a feeling so powerful it becomes a physical weight. We were not alone here. The forest, the genius loci, was aware of us. As Ben's flash cut through the gloom, illuminating the stark white of the steps, I saw something at the base, half hidden in the moss. I knelt, my glove touching the cold, damp earth. It was a camera. A high-end DSLR, its body muddy but the lens miraculously intact. Julian's. "I've got his camera." I called out, my voice low. Ben and Maria converged on my position. I carefully worked the memory card out of its slot. Our field kit included a ruggedized tablet for just this purpose. As the device booted, the three of us huddled together, the small screen, a tiny island of light in the oppressive gray. The first photos were predictable. Majestic shots of the rainforest, the massive trunks of Sitka spruce and western, hemlock draped in moss, the filtered green light. Then, the images changed. He had left the trail. The photos became more focused, tighter, centered on odd rock formations, gnarled roots. He was tracking something, or being led. Then came the first picture of the staircase, taken from a distance. It looked just as it did now, alien, clean, impossible. I swiped to the next photo. He was closer. The next, closer still. He was circling it, documenting it from every angle. Then the photos started to get strange. The perspective shifted in ways that made my head spin. Angles bent unnaturally. Lines that should have been straight appeared to curve. The top of the staircase seemed to recede in one shot and loom impossibly close in the next. It was exactly what his caption said. The geometry was all wrong. It was like looking at a physical representation of non-Euclidean space, a place where the fundamental rules of the universe no longer applied. "My God," Ben whispered, his face pale in the tablet's glow. What was he seeing? The forest seemed to darken around us, the fog coiling like a living thing. I felt a wave of dizziness, of disorientation. For a terrifying second, the trees around me seemed to shift, the path we'd taken to get here no longer clear. It was a classic symptom of woods shock, the catastrophic breakdown that happens when your internal map ceases to match the reality around you. But this wasn't just in our heads. The forest was doing this. It was a trap. "Stay close," I ordered, my own anxiety a cold knot in my gut. "We stick together." I kept scrolling through the photos. There were dozens more, each more distorted than the last. Close-ups of the smooth, seamless material. Shots looking up the stairs into the blank, gray fog. A photo of his own hand, held out against a step, the flesh of his fingers looking strangely warped and elongated. He was documenting his own descent into this madness. Then, I reached the final image. It was different. It was perfectly clear. The focus sharp, the geometry stable. The photo was taken from the top of the staircase, looking down. Looking down at the very spot where we were now huddled. In the photo, cast in the same eerie, fog, diffused light, stood three figures in ranger gear. They were staring up at the camera, their faces masks of pure horror. It was us. It was me, Ben, and Maria. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked at Ben, at Maria. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the same impossible truth. I looked back at the screen, my thumb hovering over the image details. The timestamp was there. It had been taken yesterday afternoon, at 15:48, less than 20 minutes after Julian had uploaded his post to social media. A low sound echoed through the woods. It wasn't a growl or a bird call. It was a faint, melodic humming, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that didn't belong, a sound that pulled at the edges of sanity. We hadn't just found the last known point of a missing hiker. We had walked into it. The staircase wasn't just an object, it was a place. A place where time, like the geometry, was broken. And now, I realized with a dawning, soul-crushing terror, it had us, too. The tablet slipped from my numb fingers and hit the mossy ground with a soft thud. The screen, showing the impossible photograph of us, flickered once and went dark. For a heartbeat, the world was utterly silent. Then the humming returned. Louder this time, a resonant frequency that vibrated not in our ears, but deep within our bones. It was a sound that felt ancient, a chord struck in a place outside of time. "This is a trap," Maria whispered. Her voice ragged. She was a seasoned volunteer, someone who had faced down rock slides and hypothermia without flinching, but her face was ashen. "This whole place is a trap." This she was right. This wasn't just a location, it was a presence. A genius loci that had become aware of us. The forest itself was the predator. The trees, silent and immense, were no longer just flora. They were sentinels of a malevolent consciousness. The paths we had followed felt like they were intentionally laid, the unnatural quiet, a method of herding us toward this clearing. The air grew thick, heavy with a pressure that felt like the bottom of the ocean. The fog coiled around us, not as a weather pattern, but as an appendage, isolating us, erasing the world beyond this small, terrible stage. "We need to move," I said, my voice tight, fighting the wave of psychological vertigo that threatened to pull me under. The split in my mind was widening into a chasm, the trained ranger screaming protocols, and the primal human screaming in raw terror. Now. But when we turned, the trail was gone. Where there had been a clear path, through the ferns moments before, there was now an impenetrable wall of ancient, gnarled trunks and thick, thorny undergrowth. The forest had rearranged itself. It had closed the door behind us. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Ben started to hyperventilate, his eyes darting around wildly. "We're not getting out," he stammered, his words tumbling over each other. "It knows we're here," It's been watching us the whole time. The humming intensified, and a soft, pearlescent light began to pulse from the top of the staircase, cutting through the gray mist. It was a serene, inviting light, a beacon in the oppressive gloom. The humming shifted, the discordant notes resolving into something that was almost music, a melody that promised peace, an end to the fear. It was a lure, a supernatural trap, woven from sound and light. Ben's frantic eyes locked onto the light. His breathing slowed, his panic replaced by a placid, empty calm. "Julian," he whispered, his voice suddenly devoid of emotion. "He's up there. He found the way out." "Ben, no." I grabbed his arm, but he pulled away with a strength that was shocking. He took a step toward the stairs, his movements stiff and unnatural. "Don't you hear it, Alex?" he asked, his voice taking on the melodic, layered quality of the humming. It was his mouth, but not his voice. "It's the heart of the forest. It's calling us home." He placed his foot on the first pristine white step. The moment his boot made contact, the humming surged, and a visible ripple ran through him. It was a transformation, insidious and absolute. His form seemed to waver, the lines of his body blurring at the edges. His skin took on the pale, seamless quality of the stairs, and his eyes, once blue and full of life, became gray, empty pools reflecting the swirling fog. He was being unmade, absorbed into the fabric of this place, just as the myths tell of nymphs becoming one with their trees. He was becoming part of the forest's monstrous anatomy. He took another step, and then another, his ascent slow and deliberate. He didn't look back. He was already gone. I knew with chilling certainty that to follow him, to even touch that staircase, was to be lost forever. It was no longer a search and rescue. It was a desperate primal flight. I grabbed Maria's arm, my grip bruising. "We run," I choked out. "We run, and we don't look back." We turned away from the sight of our friend, being devoured by a place that shouldn't exist, and plunged into the shifting, hostile woods. We crashed through undergrowth that tore at our clothes and skin, our feet sinking into moss that felt like it was trying to hold us fast. The forest was a labyrinth, its geometry twisting around us, time itself seeming to stretch and warp. Behind us, the beautiful, terrible music rose to a shriek of fury, the sound of a predator denied its full meal. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. Then we crawled. We didn't stop until, by some miracle, the oppressive silence broke and we heard the distant, beautiful sound of a highway. 2 days later, a different SAR team found us wandering along a service road, miles from Julian West's last known point. We were dehydrated, hypothermic, and in shock. We couldn't account for the lost time. We couldn't explain what happened to Ben Carter. The official incident report is a document of careful omissions. It lists Ranger Ben Carter as missing in action, presumed victim of a fall or exposure during a sudden, unforecasted storm. Julian West remains a missing person. The case is closed. But I know the truth. I know that the forest is not just a place. It's alive, it's ancient, and it's hungry. It has Julian, and now it has Ben. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of that impossible. Melodic humming echoing in my mind, a symptom of a trauma that has no name. I left a part of my soul in that forest, in the stillness where the trees watch. And I know, with a certainty that haunts my every waking moment, that it is still there, waiting. The official report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. Ranger Ben Carter lost to the elements. Julian West still missing, case inactive. For the outside world, it was a tragedy, another sad statistic in the annals of wilderness recreation. For me, it was the beginning of a different kind of haunting. The forest had taken Ben, but it had left a piece of itself inside me. I was diagnosed with severe PTSD. The nightmares were relentless, filled with the impossible humming sound that vibrated in my bones, and the sight of Ben's features blurring, his humanity dissolving into the pristine white of the stairs. During the day, I was plagued by hypervigilance. Every rustle of leaves outside my window, every shadow in my peripheral vision, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. The world felt thin, a fragile veneer, over a reality of wrong geometry and ancient, hungry things. I took a leave of absence, unable to bear the thought of putting on the uniform. Maria had quit the volunteer service altogether. We met once for coffee. Two survivors of a shipwreck no one else knew had happened. We didn't speak of the stairs, or the photo, or Ben. We didn't have to. We saw the same hollowed out terror reflected in each other's eyes. It was a shared trauma that was too vast and too insane for words. 6 months after the incident, I was trying to piece my life back together when the call came. It was my old supervisor, Mark. His voice was grim. A family of 4, the Petersons, parents and 2 young children, had vanished. Their minivan was found at the Hoh River, trailhead, same as Julian's. An initial hasty search had found nothing. They were organizing a full-scale operation. Mark wanted me to come in to consult on the search plan. "You know that area better than anyone, Alex," he said. "We need your eyes on the map." The blood drained from my face. It was happening again. The forest was Humphrey again. A cold, rational part of my mind. The part that had survived the woods shock, knew what I had to do. I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd have me committed. But I couldn't let them walk into that trap blind. I was the only one who knew the real terrain. The one who knew that the greatest hazard in that forest wasn't a cliff or a river, but a place that shouldn't exist. "I'll do more than that," I said, my voice a stranger to my own ears. "I'm coming with you." Returning to that forest was like willingly walking back into my own nightmare. The moment I stepped under the canopy, the familiar, oppressive silence descended. It was the silence of a predator that has been waiting. The air was thick, the green light lurid and suffocating. Every tree looked like a sentinel, every shadow a lurking threat. The new search team was competent and professional, but they were operating in a world of maps and compasses. I was operating in a world of malevolent intelligence and broken physics. I led them on a path that deliberately skirted the area where we'd found the stairs, using my knowledge to guide them through. the most difficult terrain, hoping to find the family before they stumbled into the forest's parlor. But on the second day, as a cold, thick fog rolled in, I knew we were being herded. The paths seemed to subtly shift. The silence deepened. And then, through the mist, I saw it. The staircase. It stood in the same clearing, pristine and untouched. But this time, something was different. At the top, shrouded in the swirling fog, stood the faint silhouettes of a man, a woman, and two small children. The Peterson family. They were motionless, silent. And the humming began. It was the same soul, deep vibration, but this time it was laced with a new sound. The faint, happy laughter of children. It was a lure of agonizing perfection, designed to prey on the hope and duty of a rescuer. The other rangers froze, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. I saw one of them, a young woman, take an instinctive step forward. No. The word tore from my throat. I grabbed her arm, my grip like iron. Don't look. Don't listen. It's a trap. The figures at the top of the stairs turned toward us. The man's voice, hollow and melodic, echoed through the clearing. It's okay. He sang, the voice layered and wrong, just like Ben's had been. We're safe now. Come up. It's so peaceful here. This was the true nature of the horror. It didn't just kill you, it absorbed you. It used your memory, your love, your hope, as bait for the next victim. Julian, and now the Petersons, had become part of the forest's monstrous anatomy, puppets in its eternal hunt. But this time, I wasn't paralyzed by fear. I was filled with a cold, burning rage. I would not let it have anyone else. I couldn't destroy it, but I could refuse to play its game. Everyone back away, I commanded, my voice ringing with an authority I didn't know I possessed. Slowly. Do not look at the top of the stairs. Look at the ground. Follow me. I turned my back on the impossible sight, on the siren song of the lost family, and began to walk away. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to save them, but the rational survivor in my head knew they were already gone. The humming intensified, the laughter turning into a sound of pleading, then frustration, then a shriek of pure, inhuman rage that seemed to shake the trees themselves. We made it out. The official search was eventually called off. The Peterson family joined Julian, West, and Ben Carter on the list of the lost. I didn't quit the service. I returned, but I was a different man. I am no longer a ranger who serves the public. I am a guardian. I patrol the boundaries of that section of the forest, my face grim, my eyes hard. I am the one who closes trails for maintenance that never ends. I am the one who creates diversions, who warns hikers away with stories of landslides or aggressive bears. I am the lie that protects the innocent from the truth. I have a new, secret, and eternal duty to stand at the threshold of that hungry place, to be the keeper of a prison made of trees. The forest is still there. It is still watching, and I am watching it back.